You're listening to Panthers on Tap. I'm Curtis Rauen, joined by Bryson Karbley. We're just two fans sharing our love for the game and Carolina Panthers football. So join us, crack open a cold one, some bubbly, a little wine, some scotch. We don't care, whatever makes you sleep better at night. Before we dive into the episode, a little self-promotion. Stop what you're doing. Go give us a follow on Twitter at Panthers on Tap. Join the discussion on our Facebook group. We have over 2,500 members. You can listen to us wherever you get your podcast. Just search Panthers on Tap. First Ron Rivera, then Matt Rule, and now Frank Reich. David Tepper, for the third time in his short stint as owner, has fired the head coach in season. 6 head coaches since 2018. A lot to unpack tonight with David Tepper's 13-minute, 55-second. You're damn right I counted it tonight. Only 8 questions answered in this one. Bryson, a lot to unpack, and we got a full slate of guests with you guys. We got Panthers culture. You guys, we call him JJ Hardy on the show, but you guys know him as Panthers culture on X. One of my favorite follows on Twitter, X, whatever the hell you want to call it. I keep bouncing back and forth. And then we got Ricky Raines. He's at Ricky Bobody on X, contributing for Cat Cray blog. He's also got his own podcast, Kitty Lit Podcast. He's been on several times now with us. Ricky and JJ, pleasure to have both you guys with us tonight.
Thank you for having me, man.
Yeah, man. Appreciate you having me back on.
All right, let's get into the Frank Reich hiring. We've let the dust settle. I know everyone has put out their opinions by now of what they thought of Frank Reich and his tenure, his very short tenure, 1-10, 11 games. Bryson, I want to start with you on this overall reaction to this firing.
Yeah, I think, over the past 10, 11 weeks in Carolina, it's been rough. Someone losing their job is never fun, I think, for the person involved that's losing their job. From all accounts, Frank Reich has been a good guy in Carolina, and any position he's been in throughout the league in his coaching career, his playing career, seems like a genuine person, but just kind of the wrong place, the wrong time in Carolina, and obviously not really what we needed at this point in time. A 1-10 record really speaks for itself, in my opinion. Lost a lot of games that the Panthers really should have won. And the offense, which is supposed to be his baby, has been the worst in the NFL, arguably. Bryce has regressed throughout the season instead of shown growth, which is the opposite of what you want when you invest the capital that, the Panthers did in Bryce Young. I just think when there's no need to drag it on. I don't think keeping him through the rest of the season really does anything positive for Bryce Young. So I think maybe putting him into a position like the Panthers have done with Jim Caldwell and Thomas Brown really being the two main characters or coaches in his ear, in Bryce's ear, and, getting their aspect instead of the one that he was getting from Frank Reich, which obviously wasn't working, could help him, show some progress before the end of the year. So again, to make a long story short, there is a little bit of a somber, I guess, attitude for me because, again, Frank was a good dude. I really wanted it to work out with everything he had going, being the first Panthers quarterback in history, being a good dude, really had some success in the league before coming to Carolina, but, it just didn't work out. So here we are again, a year later. We're going to be looking for another head coach.
Yeah, a coworker of mine asked me tonight, like, what do you think of the whole situation? The first word I said was inevitable. I think the writing was on the wall for weeks. I know I've been on the record a couple of weeks ago saying I thought this probably should have happened at the end of the season because I don't know what good it did Bryce. But that has quickly changed for me over these last couple of weeks of just seeing really regression by Bryce Young and this offense as a whole. And it's really ironic that they brought Frank Reich in as this offensive quote-unquote guru, and that was the worst part of this team this season, which is just – it's kind of laughable. It's laughable to think about. But yeah, I mean, it was just stagnant. Don't want to reiterate what you said, but just a stagnant offense. not much change. We were talking about it before we hit the record button, and I don't know how many times you can keep doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. We've said that for weeks now, and that was the case with Frank Reich. And reports are going to be coming out now these next couple days from both sides, which side you want to take. But it sounds like there was some stubbornness there from the 62-year-old coach, and there wasn't a lot that he really wanted to change. So again, we'll see how this thing works out, but I want to go to JJ on this. JJ, I had you on. It was just me and you. I listened to about 20 minutes of our episode that we had when Frank Reich was hired. You liked him. Now you liked him then. I just want to get your thoughts. And no really fault of your own, because I think a lot of people thought this, but you had said we're going to win some football games with Frank Reich, and we're sitting here with one win. What do you think went wrong with his short tenure here?
You're right. This whole experience has been really bittersweet for me, because I fell for Frank Reich years ago. I think it was about 2 seasons ago on Hard Knocks. It may have been 3 seasons now. I can't remember, but they featured the Colts on Hard Knocks, I believe. And I remember just watching that show. The Colts were having success, and Frank just seemed like a really good, genuine dude. And at that time, the Colts culture seemed like a culture that the guys wanted to be part of. Like, I remember seeing gatherings at players' houses, and everybody seemed to be really getting along. They featured a couple of offensive linemen and just the relationships they had. And I felt like a lot of what was going on in Indianapolis was cultivated by Frank Reich. So when things fell apart last year in Indianapolis, originally I believe that he probably should have been fired, because I believe they fired their offensive coordinator the week or so before he got fired. And when I learned that Frank Reich, after losing his job in Indianapolis, retreated to North Carolina where his family was, and then we had an opening, for some reason I felt like, with David Tepper saying that he was seeking an offensive-minded coach, us knowing that we would be in the market for a young rookie play caller, or quarterback, I said, man, it's going to be hard to ignore the fact that Frank Reich is sitting right there in the backyard while you're looking for a coach who is offensive-minded, has worked well with quarterbacks, has NFL credibility, was the first Panthers quarterback in the history of the franchise. And it just felt like a story that was aligning too well to ignore. And if you remember me, even at the end of last season, I think I was on here, or maybe it was like early in the offseason, when everybody was saying these other names, I felt really strongly that Frank Reich might be the guy, just because he checked so many boxes. I didn't think he was like the sexiest hire. I thought he was a sensible hire. And again, I won't run away from the fact that I liked him, because I still like the man. I think he's a great man. But I think where it went wrong, just to answer your question, is when he was hired, I think he had a different idea of how much control he would have over the quarterback that he got. And I won't get into the Bryce versus CJ, or as a matter of fact, we could talk about Derek Carr, right? Nobody's talking about that little element that we heard early in the offseason about how much he liked Derek Carr when he was available. But Frank Reich obviously had a vision for what he wanted to see from the quarterback position. The Derek Carr thing really kind of made me pause a little bit, because I was like, oh, this is Frank Reich returning to the same guy that we heard he was in Indianapolis, wanting to go with one of these veteran guys, a retread type veteran quarterback who had some success previously, and seeing if he could kind of work with that guy. CJ Stroud, again, he was somebody that I felt was really compatible with what I had seen on film from Frank Reich's offenses. And so I thought that made a lot of sense. You know, Frank Reich had never coached a quarterback who was below 6'4". And so I think, like, again, to try to avoid all that conversation, I think Frank Reich is a symptom of the bigger disease in Carolina, right? And I think coming in, I don't think he thought he was that. But I think shortly after being hired and some of the events that transpired, you know, the Panthers trading up to get the #1 overall pick, I think for Frank Reich, I think that took away some of his options for who he could coach and how he wanted to coach them. Because when they did that, just listening to what they're saying, it was all with the intentions of drafting Bryce Young. And I, in my heart, would never believe that Frank Reich's #1 choice for quarterback was Bryce Young. I think maybe everybody else's choice was Bryce Young. I don't believe that somebody who's played in the league as a 6'4" quarterback, somebody who's never coached a quarterback beneath that size, gets one shot to draft the #1 pick overall at quarterback and just goes completely away from everything that he's ever done. That's just me. But I think his problem in Carolina started when he was asked to coach a type of quarterback that he wasn't comfortable with. That's just speculation on my part. I'm sorry if I'm wrong. But that's where I think it went wrong. I think Carolina's problem for the last 5 to 6 years has been misalignment. I think Frank Reich becoming the coach, being asked to coach a type that he wasn't comfortable with, was just another example of misaligned vision here in Carolina. And I think, you know, we suffered as fans as a result, because we all could go back and look at what was being said about the coaching staff in Carolina, you know, 6, 7, 8 months ago. Everybody thought that we were headed up, right? You know, we built
Everyone.
Yeah, everyone. It was consensus on television, on the radio, any kind of blog, you know, like it was Carolina's pointing in the right direction because we had an all-star staff. There's clips of Thomas Brown saying that to Bryce Young's dad. Like, I thought
Bryce Young's dad thinking it.
Yeah, I mean, and honestly, you know, it's easy to rag Frank Reich today, but that staff came together because of Frank Reich and who he is as a man, right? Everybody can say, oh, you know, I never understood the pick in Carolina.
It also came together because of money, but that's another point.
But it's money. But you know what? You know, the thing that is looked at as a weakness for Frank Reich and failure is a strength until it fails. That's the person that can allow for all these different personalities to come on your team, and, you know, them not feel intimidated by the head coach and feel like, you know, there's an openness, you know, to collaboration, you know, to me bringing in my strengths and where I came from. Don't think that actually played out well, but I think going into it, all these guys at least were made to feel with Frank Reich they could come in and find a spot, find a niche here on this team. And but I mean, there's a lot of people who praise Frank Reich on the way to Carolina and up until the games start being played. When the games start being played and the performance on the field offensively started coming up short, that's when people start saying, oh, you remember he got fired so quickly in Indy last year and this and that, and everybody wants to stand on those things. But nah, man, I mean, I think I can't say Frank was, I mean, obviously he looks like a horrible hire now, but I don't think that they necessarily hired a bad coach, a bad man. I think they hired a man that didn't necessarily fit
align with their vision.
Yeah, he didn't align with the ultimate vision that everybody seemed to eventually come around to. And it's unfortunate, you know, for Frank, you know, for everybody who was rooting for him. I think it's unfortunate for Bryce Young, to be honest, because we can say what we want to say, but the reality is the only head coach he's ever had in the NFL is Frank Reich so far. And so everything that he was learning, you know, the conversations that had been had, you know, the mentoring that was going on, it may have not looked right, but that's been his example so far. So now we have to hope that that this change does not affect Bryce Young. We got to hope that Bryce Young doesn't take any accountability. Nobody's talking about that he's not taking this personal as if, did I get my coach fired based on my play? Based on me not being able to execute some of the things that he trusted me to do. And so I don't know if that'll happen or not, but that's just me thinking outside the box. Like, how does this really affect Bryce Young? Do he, like everybody's asked him, for some of these other transactions that's happened up to this point, about the business of the NFL. And he's always kind of had like some comments about, how it feels and, it's not natural, but, blah, 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 Now he's lost his head coach largely based on how the offense that he runs has performed. And so now I'm concerned about how he's handling failure. Bryce has never failed in his career at any level. And now he has probably more losses this season than he's lost across all the years of his life playing football.
Mm-hmm.
And he's lost a coach. He's never gone through anything like this. And so mentally, I just wonder how Bryce is handling what failure at the NFL looks like, and hoping that he's not taking on too much of the blame for his coach losing his job mid-season. So yeah, I mean, that's all I really have on it. I think it's an unfortunate situation, just because I think us as fans, we've suffered. I was relieved when I saw the news break, and I was only relieved for the reasons that y'all said before. There's no benefit to really keeping Frank Reich for the rest of the season, and the relief also comes from, I was really worried that we might run it back with Frank Reich to see if he could do something different next year. And honestly, the thought of that ever since probably, week 5 or 6 has honestly made me sick, thinking that we were going to have to see a different version of Frank Reich potentially in year 2. And I just don't have the patience for it, man. I'm 45 years old. I don't have time to be waiting for rebuilds and recoaches and all that stuff. So,
buckle up.
Yeah, I want to see some change, man. I want to see it happen pretty quick. So that's all I got.
Ricky, what about you? Reaction to the firing?
Yeah, man. Look, I think y'all touched on it, and JJ made some really good points there. To piggyback a little bit off of one of JJ's points about the relationships that Frank was able to have with his networking and have with the respect that he had earned and built within the league, right? I think that was a really big part of this hire, as JJ was saying, because of also who was the coach prior to hiring Frank Reich. We had a college coach that had pretty much convinced everybody that he was going to be the answer of building a program. Now, when I say everybody, I mean he convinced the people within the South Mint Street building that he was the answer of building a program, right? But he did that by also saying he was going to bring his people and not outside, because his people was all he really knew. Now, we got Joe Brady, but that was kind of just like that sexy hot name, not necessarily a qualified person to come in and execute an NFL offense from an offensive coordinator position. But what Frank was able to do was bring in all of these names. And I will say this, man, in a typical situation when you fire your head coach, your interim isn't going to be, or your interim and your offensive coordinator and having a special offensive assistant that is going to help your offensive coordinator usually doesn't include Jim Caldwell type of candidates, right? Jim Caldwell, I mean, that's a serious NFL figure, man. I mean, this dude has won on historically bad teams. He has won with circumstances that the cards were kind of against him, and he persevered. This is a smart person. This is a person that has been around a lot of quarterback development. We could be in a worse situation if we had not hired Frank Reich. So I want to give him a little bit of credit for what he also brought into the building with him. But here's the reality of the situation, man. Frank did not figure out how to mesh his offensive philosophies and his personality with the offensive philosophies and personality of the other star-studded coaches that they brought in. It's a adage that has been said over and over: too many chefs in the kitchen, too many voices. And it's a true thing, because what they didn't do is they didn't come up with a vision. They did not come up with a cohesive plan. You look at all of these things, and I'm sure that we'll talk about possibilities of head coaches to fill that vacancy. We'll talk about GMs if Scott Fitterer were to go. These best situations that we see forming with that kind of openings with head coaches and GMs is when they're cohesive and they come from a similar train of thought. They are working together to put a puzzle together. They know which pieces they have. They know which pieces they need. And it's not just let's put that puzzle together and then we can take it apart and build a new one. It's let's put that puzzle together and let's keep it in place for a long time. Like, we're going to frame that puzzle. It's going to be so damn good when we put that thing together. We're going to leave it on the kitchen table for a month so that all of our friends come over and see that 500-piece jigsaw that we put together, right? That's not what they've done here. They've tried to do this like patchwork stuff. Hey, thank you for trying, because I just wanted something different than Matt Rule. I appreciate the effort. I did not see this being able to get righted. There was no way that everything that we had saw, with no attempt at doing different things, especially on offense. We talk about him being an offensive coach, offensive-minded guru, quarterbacks guy. We're 29th or worse in every major offensive statistical category. That buck falls at somebody's feet, man, and it falls at the head coach's feet when you're the play caller as well. And then you take that play calling away from yourself, you give it to Thomas Brown, you give him 3 games. He won one. You can put it on the defense and say the defense won that game. Doesn't matter, man. Thomas Brown called that game, and that offense executed efficiently. Like, yeah, they didn't put up a ton of points. That was one of the more efficient offensive performances you can see. If you go back and watch the film of all these games this year, that was one of our more complete offensive games. And we did it off of a bye week. Maybe if you give Frank Reich 2 weeks to plan every single game, maybe that's the right way to go about it, right? But in the NFL, you only get 6 days, 5 days. That wasn't working out this year, man. And I appreciate everything that Frank brought here and the efforts that he tried, but it wasn't working, man. And I think that this was the best thing for Bryce Young. I think it was the best thing for the Panthers. And I think it was the best thing for the fan base, because I think now we have to start looking forward and say, what is the right way to go about fixing this, and start holding people accountable. And maybe that starts with the GM next.
Well, what's funny about it is, and you guys touched on it a little bit, but they brought in Matt Rule from college, this up and coming coach, hot in the college ranks with his own staff. That didn't work out. So then Frank Reich tried to do the exact opposite of that, bring in all of this experience, 60, 70 years in the NFL. And then, Frank, you got to go out and go after different guys. Don't just bring your guys in and try to pick and part of Sean McVay and this offense and this defense and pull it all together. And then you have this complete mess where, and Bryson and I have talked about this for a couple of weeks, too many cooks in the kitchen. And then you couple that with Frank not wanting to change his offense. It's just a complete disaster. So now we'll talk about this later. I think Tepper now goes the opposite direction. He's going to want a young, upcoming coach who's this innovative style guy who can come in and build off and, raise Bryce Young up. And I think that's what he's just going to go back the other way, and he's going to try to go after someone young. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but
can I ask you one last thing too? Can I just throw in one last thing, because I forgot to mention it, and I think that it's really important when talking about Frank. This is a guy that just got fired midway through the season, and I'm not trying to harp on that aspect, but he also didn't have any time off, right? You're talking about, this is almost like imagine like a heavyweight boxing match, right? And there's a rematch clause in there. But this one dude just got his ass whooped. I mean, he got his ass whooped, man. He's exhausted. He's taken a beating, and he has not had time to go back to the drawing board and recompose a attack plan, right? And figure out, where did I get beat? He asked for a rematch like the day later in the same venue. Like, no, I want to fight him again. Like, I can't see out of my right eye, but I want to fight him again. It's just never going to work out, man. The first guy already whooped your ass. You got to take some time off. You know what I mean? Take a minute, regroup, get back to health, and maybe then you'll have a fresh approach at how you should attack the game.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I tweeted this out. I think it was one of JJ's posts. He was asking about the Pat McAfee show, and I listened to McAfee's show quite a bit, and I think it was when Thomas Brown flipped, or when they flipped with the play calling with Thomas Brown, went back to Frank Reich. Pat McAfee said on his show, and Pat McAfee is very in tune with that Colts organization, and he had said he was shocked that Frank Reich was the first hire of this last coaching cycle after being fired in November. he reported, or he was saying that he had lost the locker room. Guys weren't showing up to meetings. Guys were gambling on the side. There was several Colts players that got busted for the sports gambling. He said their offense was not moving the ball. They hadn't scored an offensive touchdown in weeks prior to his firing. And it was just a complete disaster. He said that guy, more than anyone, needed a year off to just like the McCarthy thing. When McCarthy left Green Bay, he took a year off, collected his thoughts, studied all these offensive things. And Frank Reich just jumped right back, like you said, jumped right back in the ring and wanted to take another hit, another round. And it's that, I think, it just compounded everything. And Pat McAfee said from the start today, I think Michael Lombardi said it too today, is just that was never a good fit from the start. It seemed like the writing was on the wall pretty damn early on. But let's get into David Tepper. Oh, do you want to jump in, JJ? Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, just before we move off of Frank Reich, because I was pretty excited. I never really watched the Colts a lot, to be honest. But they were having success. And so, I thought that last year may have been an anomaly because it truly would have been Frank Reich's first losing season if it had continued that way. And so, but people started following me on Twitter from the Colts, and it would surprise me. But then I started getting DMs, from some of their writers. And, they were trying to warn me. And I was like, oh, snap. And pointing me to articles and things that had been written. And one of the articles that kind of, it honestly kind of freaked me out, but I didn't want to talk about it, especially, on Twitter or on a podcast or anything, but one of the articles spoke to why Irsay was so mad at Frank. And it went back to the 2021 draft. Irsay wanted to trade up, I believe, to pick Justin Fields. And Frank Reich said, no, I'm going to go with Carson Wentz. That was his guy from Philly. And when that season, if you remember how that season ended in Jacksonville, Irsay all but lost it because although I think Carson Wentz had a good statistical year, I think Irsay was like, now we're stuck again. We're going to have to move this guy. We still don't have a quarterback. And it's all because I asked for a quarterback. You told me that you wanted to go with Carson. And we are back in the same situation. And that was the beginning of the end for Frank Reich. Up to that point, I thought that it was, Irsay being Jim Irsay and Chris Ballard,
and that's the problem. Would we be in this situation, or as fans have believed in him, if it wasn't Jim Irsay as the owner? Because everyone thinks, oh, it's Jim Irsay. I mean, the guy who's had drug issues is a Looney Tune on, on Twitter and all this.
Yeah.
And so, it was Irsay's problem. It wasn't Frank Reich. But if it wasn't Irsay at the helm, you might have been able to read between the lines and said, oh, Frank Reich is actually the problem here. And I think that was that's probably another layer to it.
That actually got me. It was 1 week I was like, yeah, Frank Reich deserves to get canned in Indy. And then Irsay and Ballard had a press conference. And to me, they seemed a little bit off the rails together at that press conference. And I was like, oh, hold up. Maybe it wasn't Frank. Maybe it was those guys, right? And but yeah, people reached out to me. I ended up being pointed to this article. I read it and I was like, oh crap, I can't talk about this. This is worrisome. But but we had the first overall pick. And honestly, I was like, well, if they get this pick right, then that won't be a concern of ours because he'll finally get his rookie guy and all that. And then again, as I mentioned before, then you heard the rumors about the interest in Derek Carr. And I was like, oh, don't do it, Frank. Don't mess this up. And I was honestly, I was really scared, but it didn't happen. But anyway, man, I'm relieved again that we're not going to go into the offseason worried about what Frank Reich will look like in year 2. So I mean, we can move on to the next thing, but I just add that too.
All right, let's talk about Tepper because that was obviously what happened today. I mentioned it off the top. 13-minute, 55-second press conference. We had 8 questions. You could say 7, and then literally as Tepper's running away, an 8th. I just want to get your guys' thoughts. Bryson, let's go to you. Initial thoughts on the Tepper press conference and what he said. What stuck out to you, if anything?
Well, obviously, the fans in Carolina deserve more from Tepper after, a year of not hearing from him through this tumultuous season that we've had, winning one game through 11 in a year that we thought we were going to be competing for a playoff spot or the NFC South. It sucks. I feel like his answers were canned. They were coach talk, so to speak. I feel like he didn't really take much responsibility for what has happened in regards to the hiring of the coaches and then the firings of the coaches in the middle of the season. But I feel like, I'm probably going to get a little heat for this, but Curtis, I think, I've kind of defended David Tepper just a little bit. He obviously has his shortcomings as an owner. Meddling in football operations is obviously unacceptable. He does not have the acumen to understand talent or anything like that. So that aside, I do think David Tepper wants to win. I do not think he is an owner that is okay with losing. I think he wants to win just as bad as any of us here talking do. I think that this past offseason was a prime example of his want to win, and that he handed Frank Reich a blank check and said, go get your staff. They probably have one of the highest paid staffs in the NFL right now, if I had to guess. He okayed the trade up to number 1 to trade all these assets to get a quarterback, which Carolina has been missing since Cam Newton left, or since Cam Newton was dismissed, I should say. He does have his shortcomings, but I do think he really wants to win. And he needs to quit meddling in the football operation. Sometimes the best thing you can do is just leave it alone and let the football people do the football things. Obviously, he's treating this as he thinks he's made billions of dollars as a hedge fund manager, and he thinks he can do football as well. And obviously you can't. You've struggled to find a head coach that can get the job done. There's been rumors of you making football decisions that haven't worked out for the greater good for this team. But I think ultimately, if he does this next go around, hire a firm to hire both a GM and head coach together, or maybe, I'll get into a candidate later. I think JJ and I are kind of on the same page on this one, but a candidate later that can kind of run things himself. I think that, and put Tepper in his place when Tepper attempts to insert himself into football decisions, I think would be the best thing for him. I wish Scott Fowler was able to ask his questions, because I read through that article, and that's a perfect question for Tepper, because I think it's important for him to be held accountable for what he's done in regards to the decisions that he's made on the football operation side of things and not just the business side of things. But unfortunately, Scott Fowler was kind of shut off for unknown reasons. But I think it's important to acknowledge both things in this situation. Yes, Tepper has been unsuccessful in a lot of ways in Carolina, but I do not think we are strapped with an owner that does not want to win, that does not want to spend money, like other owners across the league that are okay with the status quo of losing. I don't think he's okay with it. I think he gets just as mad as we do when we lose, but I think it's time for him to realize that he's the problem, and he needs to remove himself from the situation so the football people can do the football things.
Ricky, let's go to you.
Yeah, I think that the biggest problem I had was what we touched on with the questions that were allowed to be asked. The handling of handing that off to the PR guy and him choosing who was asking the questions. Hearing some of the beat reporters speak, whether it was during spaces or some of the tweets that followed afterwards, they were not expecting a 6-question, 7-question presser. They anticipated getting a full allotment of time that they typically do, right? Of the 20 to 30 minute variety, everyone getting to ask questions. You hear the process that it went through of Scott Fowler sitting right next to Vashti Hurts, who was from Carolina Blitz, sitting right there in the front row, Scott having his hand up the entire time. knowing how the last press conference between Scott Fowler and David Tepper turned out, seeing the article that Scott published the night before the presser today, it's a very calculated and unsafe way to go about things, in my opinion, if you're David Tepper, because what this press conference was for was to speak to the trajectory of the Carolina Panthers football team following the dismissal of your head coach in season, right? That was what it was about. It's introducing the interim, and it's talking about the decision that you've made and where do you go from here. He had the Charlotte Business Journal in there and gave them a question to ask about the business side of things and how the events and all this stuff are playing into what he's done for the Charlotte economy and all these. I mean, man, you saw David Tepper's face light up like a Christmas tree when he knew that he was getting to talk to the Charlotte Business Journal instead of sports people. He was giddy, man. And he literally said to them, he's like, oh, yeah, I could talk business with you. You're a business person. He sounded like Donald Trump, man, to be completely honest. He sounded like Donald Trump who had a Fox News T-ball just handed to him. And he's like, oh, I'm going to smash this one. But in true smash fashion, all he did was find a couple hot words and he circled around them. Like, that's just all he can do. And it's really disheartening for me as a fan that when you get the opportunity for a little bit of transparency and you get the opportunity to have the local media that I think that we all believe in and support, because, I mean, dude, we've got some really, really good beat reporters on this trail here. You know what I mean? We've got Sheena, we've got Vashti, we've got Mike K, Scott Fowler. I mean, Joe Person, and Joe tried his damnedest, man. He tried to get him to answer some questions, right? I mean, literally, while he was running off the podium, Joe was screaming at him, "Is Scott Fitterer safe? What's up with Scott Fitterer?" And that was just trying to get an answer because he was already running away from the situation that he put himself in. He said that he would not give any particulars. Well, then what are you doing a press conference for, man? The press conference is for particulars. It's to give your side of things, to give your perspective, and to give context to the decisions that you've made. He starts talking about shit like it's gossip around Charlotte. He's like, if you live around town, you know what I mean. You know what I mean if you're in town. What are you talking about, bro? I live in Charlotte. I'm from Charlotte, born and raised. I ain't heard a single bad thing about Frank Reich. Like, that's just a crazy thing to insinuate that we'll find out the hot gossip if you live around town. I want him to just put his checkbook out on a desk somewhere and tell somebody else to do it for him. And I will say that I agree with Bryson on I don't get the feeling that he wants to lose. I don't get a feeling he's trying to sabotage and move to London. Like, that's not what I get. I think he wants to win too, because and maybe his desire is a little bit different than fans though, right? Our desire is to have a championship of the team that we love. His desire is to not be a laughingstock anymore at this point. It's saving face and it's making money. He's going to make money regardless, and he keeps talking about that because of these events with Garth Brooks and Luke Combs and whoever the hell else is going to get transplants from all over the country to come and watch them, because Charlotte's not even that interested in those guys, right? But I think that what the main goal of winning, I think that it exists for him and for us. And he did show that he would give all the money he could. I mean, Jim Caldwell, man, you know he got a bag. He said that he wouldn't take another job other than a head coaching job, and he came on as a special offensive assistant. The key word there is special, because whatever he got paid was a special amount. There was a special amount.
We still don't know what that motherfucker's
and you never will. You'll
honest.
Never know, man. Jim Caldwell is old school as hell. That dude is never going to tell you what he got to come here. All he's going to do is smile. He's going to smile, and you're just going to know right there. Every single tooth you see is probably a zero. Like, that dude got paid to come in here and help Frank Reich when Frank Reich was lost. And so I do have this quasi-fake sense of like optimism that if he has that money and he has the willingness to dole it out, all we need is the one person in a higher up position that will act the opposite of how Scott Fitterer has acted. We need somebody to come in and say, I can handle this. Please back up. Please, your wife seems like a lovely lady. Please ask her to back up. Like, I just need my personal space so that I can do my job. That would be my take on it.
We don't need Nicole Tepper scouting the offensive line at practice.
I don't think that she's going to tell us what is happening with our pooling center. I don't think that she's going to be able to diagnose that issue.
I want to say, before JJ jumps in here, I just want to say this, speaking as a PSL owner who owns seats in that stadium, is I don't give a damn about this soccer team. I don't give a damn about the concerts. I've been to them, but I don't give a damn about it. I care about what your product is on the football field. until Tepper stops mentioning Messi and Charlotte FC and concerts and 40 some events in a year in a press conference after you fire head coach, none of this is going to change whatsoever.
Yep.
He needs to look his ass in the mirror, just like Scott Fowler said. He is the problem. He needs to find someone to hire this next coach, and he needs to quit meddling, because that has been the sole reason why I think this team has failed mightily, and he's picked the wrong guy at every stop he's had. So that's kind of my take on it. I don't have much faith because I don't think it is changing. When he fired Matt Rule, he talked about the concerts and the soccer team. And then this year, Charlotte Business Journal, I mean, that guy was smiling ear to ear when he got that question. He took about 2.5 minutes. It was his longest answer. And he went on about Messi, not even on Charlotte FC, of how he brought fans into that stadium. And I was hoping a follow-up would have been, well, what about the Cowboys game a couple of weeks ago when Dallas brought 40,000 fans here? And it took me from 10 a.m. to get to my parking spot, and every parking spot had a fucking raised up price to $60, $70, $80. And Charlotte turned into Dallas. I mean, it was ridiculous. So I was hoping that was the follow-up to that. Obviously, that didn't transpire. But JJ, go ahead.
I didn't hear the press in real time. I had work business going on, and so after I got finished with that, I ran to Twitter so I could find out what happened. I did end up listening to it this evening, while I was driving. And I think, my feelings are related to, what each of you have said. I think to your part, Curtis, if I was a season ticket or PSL owner, I know I would want more from the owner of this team, right? I would want him to reassure me that the investment I made in this team was worth me continuing year after year, because that's been one of my biggest gripes. I thank God that I'm in a position financially to be able to own season tickets if I wanted to be able to come to Charlotte and go to games and get the seats that I want. But I don't, right? Curtis, I've talked to you a few times this year about potentially coming up. And I think I'm just at a point now where, I gather my family, sometimes just me and my son, at a minimum, to drive 4 hours to come to Charlotte, to see a football game, right? The same football game I can sit in front of my big screen and watch, but I want to come and experience a football game and share that experience with my son, right? And we've never experienced a winning game, ever. I'm like 0-8. And the last time I was in Charlotte, just like this Dallas game that you mentioned, it was the San Francisco game last year that Rule got fired after. And it was so crazy because it was third down. And like literally we couldn't stop their fans from disrupting our quarterback, our offense. And I felt helpless in our own stadium, in that situation. And I was like, man, this isn't a good experience. I spent a few $100s to come up here. I've made this drive, and to come and experience what felt like an away game in Charlotte. Nah, I actually told my wife ahead of this year, I said, and I didn't do it this past weekend because I was so off with the team. But I said I would rather go to Tennessee or an away game the next time, because at least if I experienced that, it would be for a good reason. I would be in another team stadium, not our team stadium. And so I almost drove to Nashville just because I circled that game as a game to attend. Charlotte or Carolina, has a David Tepper problem. As Ricky mentioned, I do sense a little narcissism in David Tepper. The comparison to Trump, I think, is accurate. I think he's a Trump nemesis based on some previous interviews, but I think a lot of that's because they're so similar, right? So I think he's annoying to him because of the way that people like that think, not to make it specific about Trump, whatever, but It's just people who are like that, they get really annoyed when somebody else loves the attention, loves to stay in the news, loves to get praise, right? And what you mentioned, Curtis, is the thing that bothers me the most. And I think I even mentioned it to an extent when it happened. I felt like it was negative when he bought the soccer team. Not for Greater Charlotte and not for soccer fans and not for, bringing that sport to the Carolinas or to Charlotte. I think it was because I don't think we were good enough to expand. It's like when you start a restaurant and, I don't care if it's a burger spot, like you make really good burgers and you have like this niche and you have customers who love coming to your burger spot because it feels homemade and, everybody has relationships. But as soon as you see like a lick of profitability, you're like, oh, I want to franchise now, right? I want to expand. I want to build, burger spots all across town. And then when you start doing that, now your quality at the other burger spots don't match the quality of the original. You start getting complaints on Yelp, because, everybody doesn't get the same experience as they do the original spot. And so now you go from being a 4.5 restaurant to a 2.5, right? And so and you're like, oh, what happened? I still make good burgers. No, you can't maintain the quality. And the problem is with us, we never had the quality of the football team. Now you focused on soccer. Now you're looking at, oh, how can I bring in these stars and put them in BOA so our fans can see concerts. Let's change the field to turf, right? So it can be cost effective for all the different events that we host. And things or the focus gets away from football. He said something today during that press conference that kind of made me upset. And it may be true, but I don't care. He mentioned that, people don't leave me and my business is away from football.
Yeah.
I won't call some of these guys out, but I have talked to a couple. There has been employees of the Panthers, a lot of them are on Twitter, that have left. They had prominent roles for years in different capacities, and they have left within the last 3 to 4 seasons for various reasons. They come out, they tweet, I decided to do this with my life and blah, 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 blah. I'm moving on and I'm doing that and doing this. I will tell you this. One, I had a pretty good relationship with. And I was surprised that they weren't employees anymore. So I tweeted about it. They DM'd me. And so I'll just say this. When I asked about the environment, and multiple employees have shared similar sentiments, but this one just resonated with me. They said that Tepper loves for people to stand up to him, but only to obliterate them when they do. So he likes for somebody to have the balls to say, hey, look, I think this, or to challenge him, on an idea, on a stance, on whatever. But then he obliterates them, right? So you guys, you all probably work in different backgrounds and different fields. You've been in environments or even in football teams or whatever. What happens when the other person or the other people see you obliterate one too many people? They're going to just start acquiescing to what you want. They're going to start pretending to like what you like because nobody wants to be obliterated.
They're not going to willfully subject themselves to that.
Right. They're not going to willfully do it. So it's like, step up to the, to the challenge. Like, here's my idea. If anybody has a counter to it, please speak up. And then when you speak up, he makes you look like an idiot. Right. Yep. And so people have left. Right. David Tepper, he has a different sense of who he is, compared to what we actually see him producing. And like you said, the thing that keeps coming back to me, Curtis, is how you feel. Football, for football fans, really is all that matters. Because either you are a football fan and then you like baseball and you like hockey and you like basketball, or you like one of these people that's like, or you like one of those other things, that football is just something that you just like watching as entertainment. But true football fans pour into football. And we don't care what happens in soccer.
Well, even if I was a soccer fan, when you fire a coach in your football operations, I don't give a shit, and I don't want to hear about your soccer program.
Yeah.
I want to hear about your football program that you fucked up.
Yeah, and what I would say is that, you know, it's just like I've traveled the world and you meet these soccer fans internationally, like they're like 100% locked into like soccer or football or whatever they call their football. And I get their passion. But in America, football for us is American football, and we have that passion for this sport. And so I'm going to have a different level of passion. I'm a Braves fan, been a lifelong Braves fan.
Boo.
If I found out the Braves manager got fired tomorrow, I'm not going to care that much. I'm sorry, right? I'm just not. But my football team, it means a little bit different, you know, for me. And so I need details, right? And I think the biggest difference in life today compared to, you know, yesteryear, before Twitter, before social media, whatever, we all are informed, right? Mm. I'm not saying that, you know, I'm not talking about being a Twitter GM and nothing like that. I'm just saying that we all, well, most of us can go out, find information, you know, read articles, you know, like read between the lines and figure out what's wrong with situations before they even talk about it. So when you come to a press conference and only give 13 minutes, and then, like you said, control who asks questions, don't let one of the more respected writers in Charlotte ask you a question, and you know it's because of the history that you have with them. You know, you shut them out. I was on the call with you earlier. I was on the Spaces earlier when you were speaking, Ricky, with Sheena and Vashti. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the way that Sheena and Vashti basically just said, we knew from the beginning that we weren't going to be able to ask a question. Yep. And I was like, that sucks, you know.
That's crazy, man.
It's really crazy.
But even David Tepper looked shocked in that, like, and Vashti mentioned it, like he looked confused. Like his handlers were like, no, this is how it's going to be done. And he even looked blindsided at points like, do I go? Do I like there was some back and forth there that was just very awkward.
I don't believe that Tepper has a handler that has more control of the situation than he does. Right. And so
well, did you hear that guy? It was literally 30 seconds into the presser. He said, Tepper literally said, I'll open up the questions. And a reporter was about to jump in. I think it was David Newton. And there was a guy off to the side that literally said, everyone, just so you know, I'm going to be calling out who was asking questions. Right. He interrupted everything. It was so awkward.
Yeah. I mean, I heard that part, you know, but again, you know, just going back to when Stephen Drummond was like that guy, you know, he seemed to have a handle on, you know, the cadence and who got to ask what and how they responded to things. I think they probably have a person in a similar capacity doing that now. I just know that they had a game plan before they went into this press conference. And I don't think anybody surprised David Tepper because I think the repercussions of doing something against his will are too great to just do that on the fly. So I think he knew.
Well, and I don't think he wanted what happened last year with Scott Fowler. Like, I don't think he wanted that blowout that transpired at the end there. Sorry, Rick,
no, you're good. But to both of y'all's points, it was clear that the PR people had an idea of how they wanted to go about that. But to JJ's point about like there can't be a handler that can actually have more gumption or more oomph than Tepper, right? And they said that in the Spaces as well. Somebody said, they were like, so if he looked like he was surprised, because Vashti had mentioned, she was like, honestly, I think that he might have been surprised. I don't think it was his call to end it so quickly. But he also has every ability in the world that when Joe Person asked that question at the end, he did not have to keep walking. He could have stopped in his Oshbagosh or whatever things that he's got down there and turned around and answered the question. You know what I mean?
Well, and Ron Rivera did that too, and that's what I respect. Like, there was a time when Ron Rivera, and I can't remember what year it was, they got their ass kicked in a game. And the PR guy, it was probably Drummond at the time, like was going to cut off the presser, and Ron Rivera's like, no. Right. I want to hear these guys. They can ask the questions. We did not play well. And David Tepper failed to do that today. He could have been no, I'm going to answer these questions.
And Ron was just an employee getting paid by the owner. You know what I mean? We're talking about the guy that actually owns the building that he's in and who's cutting everybody's check. He could have easily turned around and be like, hey, I'm going to take that last one. but he heard what the question was from Person, and he heard Person's first question, and he didn't like that either. So he was not about to answer that question, honestly. He was like, man, let me get out of here and go eat some sort of bland meal. You know what I mean? Like, somebody's got a boiled egg for me somewhere around here.
Well, I just think it's time. I mean, I think people are trying to hold Tepper accountable finally. And honestly, I would say this, I like to, own my part. I believe early on that Tepper would be a good owner, right? The timing and, the way he kind of like came off as a maverick owner. He definitely wasn't one of the good old boys.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really believe that was going to work for Carolina, at some point. And I think he just been kind of, he kind of got stuck into like just being like a normal owner, but like a bad one. And that's the part that's disappointed me the most about him. I don't want to get into like the HQ project or anything like that being failed, but I think the signs were there the whole time. And I think we made excuses for them early, when things didn't go right. We always went back to his shrewdness and thought that he was a smart guy in the room because, he had the money. But, what people are learning now is that, I know it takes some smarts to be a billionaire, but, sometimes you can get lucky too. And it's not always about brilliance. It's about timing and just, making, one right play and you can become super wealthy. I mean, so David Tepper doesn't know enough about football. I think to Bryce's point, I do think he wants to win. I've had several people reach out to me privately and say, look, you can say a lot of things about him, but he does want to win.
Yep.
I just think he doesn't know how. You go back a couple of years ago, I think the move to try to go get Stafford, I think that was him. I think right after that, to follow that up to try to go get, pre-scandal Deshaun Watson, that was him. I also think, the persistence to stay with that to try to get him. I think that's all out of the desire to win. And, it wasn't like he went into last offseason and, with the wrong idea for a head coach. He wanted Ben Johnson. He just didn't get him. So in some ways, I feel bad for the guy because it's like he didn't always have the wrong idea. He just didn't get what he wanted and then end up doing something really bad as a result of not getting what he wanted. Like he got Donald because he couldn't get Deshaun and Stafford. He couldn't get Johnson.
Maybe we should look at it as a silver lining, which you're talking about. Like sometimes you have to be lucky and smart, and the timing just hasn't worked out for him yet. But this dude obviously has like some sort of rabbit's foot in his pocket, right? Because he's got all those zeros at the end of his bank account. That if it's not about the smarts and it's about the luck and the timing, hey man, maybe it's just a matter of time before we fall into a couple of Super Bowl wins. You know what I mean? And I don't care if we fall ass backwards into them. I'll take a Super Bowl win any way I can get it.
Well, and I thought so, and I don't remember who brought this up. I've been reading so many damn articles and watched so many videos today that I can't tell which one is which. But someone had brought up a good point. Jed York, he didn't figure it out until Harbaugh left.
Yeah,
like they didn't hit their shit until Shanahan came in, and they still haven't won one yet. And then you look at Robert Kraft. I mean, Patriots struggled for years before Bill Belichick and Tom Brady, and that took a while for him. So like. If you look at, and actually it was Kyle Bailey on Steve Smith's podcast that I was watching right before I got on here. He's the one that said that. Like a lot of owners, it's taken them time, and they failed a lot of times before they hit it. And you don't talk about Jed York anymore. You don't talk about his hand he had with Harbaugh and the disagreements they had. You don't talk about Robert Kraft and their struggles pre-Tom Brady and Bill Belichick because no one cares now because they're winning. So
that's it. Winning cures all, right?
Yes. And I think at some point that's going to come for Tepper, but obviously right now it's just not.
It's tough to see through, right? It's tough to see through really dark, thick clouds, but like there is something on the other side of it. We just got to hope that we can play it the right way and get to that quicker than the plan that they've shown so far.
Yeah. And just a side note, Curtis, Jed York went to 3 NFC championships in a row with Jim Harbaugh at the helm and just disagreed on a couple of things. I guess roster
foreshadowing.
Yeah, but I mean,
roster-wise,
there was some bad relationships though between him and Harbaugh, and that's how that thing blew up.
Well,
And that's
I
kind of
mean,
what I was alluding to. But
I'm a resident expert on that situation. I won't go through the whole history of
yeah,
that.
we don't need to get in the 49ers.
Oh, yeah, no.
I want to go ahead.
But York in that situation, York, came from the family, owning the 49ers. So he was, carrying a legacy. I think Jim Harbaugh, when he came and took over, obviously he had early success and he experienced that. But even with all that success, that version of the 49ers were still misaligned because Trent Baalke wanted roster control and Jim wanted that too. And they had friction. And eventually, they got Jim out of there. And then they struggled, right? Tom Sula, Kelly, and then that they had to figure it out. And so when they finally figured it out, they went and got John Lynch. They got Shanahan, but they got Shanahan first. They paired Lynch with him, but Lynch had zero experience in the front office. And then to make sure that Lynch had that support he needed, they went out and got my guy, Adam Peters.
We'll get into that. Hold your thought on that. Let's talk about this because I know this is going to be probably a long conversation. And this was brought up today. I know, JJ, you have been very clear on your stance on this. So David Tepper, he was obviously asked today, and it's, there's been reports out there, speculation to this point because we have not heard Frank Reich actually speak up about this. But David Tepper said today the decision to draft Bryce Young was, I think he said almost, and then he said it was unanimous across the board between coaches and scouts. And if you look online, Frank Reich's daughter has been liking a lot of tweets of, saying that Frank Reich wanted Stroud. So you have that side of things. Then you also have a guy who I think has a lot of credibility, and I think everyone in here would agree with this. Jonathan Jones from the jump in April has said that this was a unanimous decision across the board, and he still feels that way. So whatever side of the scale you want to weigh on, I just want to get your guys' take on this. JJ, I'll end on you because I know you got a lot to say about this. But Bryson, do you believe Bryce Young was Frank Reich's guy?
Whew, that's a loaded question. I do, mostly because I believe a lot of what Jonathan Jones has to say. He is one of my personal favorite reporters, one of the guys that's been connected to this franchise for a long time, one of the guys that rarely misses when reporting on the Carolina Panthers. I don't doubt that Frank Reich liked CJ Stroud. I'm sure, it's been reported that he liked all four quarterbacks when talking about the top four in the draft. I'm sure there were some things that he liked about CJ Stroud better than he liked about Bryce Young. But I think overall, when all was said and done, they listed him on the board and put him in order. I think Bryce Young was the number one quarterback unanimously throughout this front office and coaching staff. And I think that goes the same for most people evaluating players in this whole entire draft across the league, is that Bryce Young was the unanimous number one quarterback. David Tepper mentioned today in the press conference that they thought they were going to trade up to 2 and get CJ Stroud because they knew the Texans were going to take Bryce Young at 1. I mean, it was common knowledge prior to the draft that Bryce Young was the number one quarterback in this draft. I don't think there were very many people saying that CJ Stroud was number one over Bryce Young. I do believe that Bryce Young was the unanimous decision based off of just different things I've heard. I do believe Bryce Young was the right choice. I do believe Bryce Young has been in an awful situation. I do believe Bryce Young can bounce back. He has, a very strong social support system with his father being a psychologist. Perfect person to lean on through this situation. I think being sacked 40 times in your first 10 games in the NFL, 5th most all time in NFL history, and being able to get up after every single hit and prove your doubters wrong as a 5'10", 180, 190, 205 pound, whatever you want to list him as quarterback, be the smallest guy that was drafted at the quarterback position, and be one of the few ones that's been healthy throughout the most of the year besides missing one game early on. I think Bryce hasn't been perfect in Carolina. Obviously, his play can be better, and it will be better, I believe. But I think he's had a lot of things that we thought were going to go his way, not go his way in regards to this offensive line, this coaching scheme, the dysfunction from top to bottom on this coaching staff and front office to the owner. I honestly do believe that he was the unanimous decision. I do believe he was the right decision, and I do believe he will prove that over time.
Yeah, I will say this, and you can go back to our episodes last year when we discussed this. There was no doubt when Frank Reich was at CJ Stroud's pro day, he was giddy. I mean, there was no denying that whatsoever. And at that point, I was like, this is going to be the pick. But I do think, like you said, Bryson, I think that changed over time. And I think at the end of the day, it was unanimously or damn near close to unanimously across the board on who they were convicted on. And I think they made that pretty damn obvious in those 25-minute draft, whatever the hell you want to call it, confidential things across the board. And I do respect Jonathan Jones. I don't think he's ever been really wrong on Panthers reporting, and I trust, what he's put out there. And I've seen that. Even Ian Rappaport the other day said, and you mentioned it, Bryce Young was the consensus number one pick in majority of NFL teams. Did CJ Stroud fit the mold of Frank Reich's type of guy early on? Yeah, I guess you can point to that. I don't put too much weight on the daughter thing. I would really like Frank Reich to come out, but I also point to this, and I think this was kind of a downfall of Frank Reich. He is an honest guy. He isn't going to lie. I have not seen that from him in his press conferences whatsoever, and I think that was to a fault. I think sometimes he was too honest and admitted too much to the media. And he was asked at one point, where are you? Or what was this your guy? I think Joe Person asked it. There's reports out there that you did not want Bryce Young. And I get it. You can say, he's just, doing whatever he wants in front of the media. But up to this point, Frank Reich has not lied to our knowledge and has been pretty damn honest. And he said Bryce Young was his guy. And I believe that from him because I think he's been honest from the jump. And I think that's been to a fault, to be honest with you. But that's kind of where I stand. I do think I know JJ's going to disagree with that, but that's kind of where I'm at with Frank Reich. And I just think Frank Reich did not, alter his offense to solely fit what Bryce Young wanted to do. Go ahead, Ricky, and then we'll go to JJ.
I just have one thing to add real quick before you go, Ricky, if that's all right.
Yeah, man.
Just
it's your show.
I just want to add a side note. I think there's a lot of similarities to this situation to what we saw in 2021 with Mac Jones and Trevor Lawrence. In 2021, Mac Jones was at the end of the year, consensus best quarterback in that draft, quote unquote. He had the best year, made the Pro Bowl, I believe, his rookie year. Or if I'm mistaken,
he was in the top 100 his rookie year. He was in the top 100.
And of course, Trevor Lawrence was in the situation with Urban Meyer, one of the worst coaching situations in the league at the time. Now we look on that situation currently. Nobody in their right mind is going to say that Mac Jones is a better quarterback than Trevor Lawrence.
I'm not
Trevor
even
Lawrence,
saying that.
You've been a Mac Jones guy for a while, and you finally fell off the wagon, which I appreciate. But
yeah, good for you on that first.
I think there's a lot of similarities to point out there. Not all quarterbacks are on the same schedule of growth in the NFL. Yes, we thought Bryce Young was the most pro ready, but we were wrong about that. Obviously, CJ Stroud's been better. There's no denying that. But there's a lot of course, variables in that situation. And I do think, again, I think Bryce Young is still going to be the best quarterback in this draft. And maybe I'm biased. I'm sure I am, but I think that's the truth. So I just wanted to add that note in there before you go.
Yeah.
Another one too. Sorry, Ricky, and we're pushing back
good,
here.
Man.
Another one that comes to mind is RG3 and Kirk Cousins. RG3 won Rookie of the Year.
Yeah.
You don't hear about him. He's on the assignment desk at ESPN reporting and wanting to be the backup in Cleveland right now. And you have Kirk Cousins obviously down with injury, but has a long, steady career in Minnesota has made millions and millions of dollars. So I think, to Bryson's point, I think sometimes, he's had early success, but you got to sustain that. And that's tough to do. I mean, things can change quick in this league, but go ahead, Ricky.
No, you're good, man. Unfortunately for RG3 too, his leg turned into like street corn a couple times because of the game of football. So like that's something that is a little bit outside of his control, I would say. But as far as the unanimous stuff, man, I'll just put it like this, my perspective on it. I don't really care if it was unanimous or not at this point. Like that would be my main takeaway. I think that it's very possible that Frank Reich preferred or had an affinity for CJ Stroud and still voted for Bryce Young because of the sentiment of everybody else in that room. Or it's also entirely possible that it's also entirely possible that he did like Bryce Young a whole lot. He did like CJ Stroud a whole lot. And that it just is what it is, man. Like they all sat there and they came to a decision. It doesn't change any of the situation that we're in right now, right? Like finding out if Frank preferred CJ Stroud and if his daughter is trying to tell secrets by not speaking, right? If she's doing the whole Morse code of, hey, my dad did want CJ Stroud, that's fine, man. Like I would expect her to do that because that's her father. And I would expect anyone close to somebody that they love to protect them and to stand up for them if they feel like something wrong has been done to them, right? So like I have no qualms with any of that. But the thing that I would say is that if they come out and they tell us it's unanimous, if that's their word, if Frank Reich says that, if David Tepper says that, if Scott Fitterer says that, if Thomas Brown and Jim Caldwell, Josh McCown, if every single person that we have to trust with their word tells us that is the truth of the matter, I'm going to take people for their word because they also could be held accountable for that at that point. And if they go 3 years down the line, 4 years down the line, and Bryce Young, let's say that he doesn't turn things around and that he's out of the league and he flames out as a bust, which I don't personally believe to be the case. I think that he could get in a better situation. But if that happens to be the case, then you hold these guys accountable because that's what they said. Flip-flopping later on down the road is going to eliminate that integrity of the situation, in my opinion. So I take people at their word, man. I think that's what you should do. I think it's the only way to keep somebody responsible. So yeah, that's the way that I see it. I don't know that it was unanimous. There is no way that I ever will know, and I don't particularly care all that much.
All right, JJ, you have been banging this drum for weeks. I particularly think you can say I'm wrong on this if you want. I think you wanted Stroud. I think that's been clear. I think Stroud was your guy. But where do you stand on this? I know you have a lot to say, so go ahead.
Well, I mean, just to defend my desire for Stroud, last college football season, I believe Bryce Young was the best quarterback in college football. Like, clearly the best quarterback in college football. So I just want to make that clear. When I started speculating that we would get Frank Reich, I started leaning Stroud because I felt like Stroud was a perfect pairing with Frank Reich. And then when we officially hired Frank Reich, then all of my attention turned to Stroud because that's who I envisioned in Frank Reich's offense based on what I've seen of Frank Reich's offense over the past few years. When the combine happened and the reporters and the pundits and the analysts were all saying that CJ Stroud had what they said was the best throwing session of any prospect in combine history. And Frank Reich was front and center. And we have all the little videos and clips from that throwing session. And then a couple of days later or weeks or whatever, we trade up to get number one, and that started happening at the combine. Then I started thinking that what I was thinking may actually happen, right? So I'm human in that way. But in addition to that, you know, I have scouting the culture. You know, me and my guy Vincent, we go through prospects. And he and I, you know, separately came to the conclusion that CJ Stroud, we thought was the best pro prospect, not college football player, but pro prospect. because when you trade up to number one, right, you have to be able to go and check boxes of what a guy can do versus what they can't do. And unfortunately, that includes the measurables, right? I hate using Bryce's size as a limiting factor, but the reality is this is football. Let's be, we 4 men on this podcast, right? Football is an eye test thing. Big men win, right? Football position, the average quarterback is 6'2", 6'3", right? They're the size of CJ Stroud. CJ Stroud was the most accurate passer at all levels. He was close to the size that Frank Reich has always coached. And so, but beyond that, I won't even go into that. Yes, CJ Stroud was my preferred pick for these Carolina Panthers with Frank Reich as the coach. If we had a coach from the Shanahan tree, I may have leaned more towards Bryce Young because he would have made more sense in that type of scheme for me personally. But since we had Frank Reich, it was definitely CJ Stroud. But to kind of go to this whole unanimous thing and what David Tepper mentioned today, David Tepper is pretty slick. And I hope that y'all know that right now, right? He's in the business world. He didn't have to mention what they were going to do at 2 because a lot of people on Twitter and that's learned, about our process, a lot of people up to this point had believed that there was a 2-man race between Bryce Young and Anthony Richardson based on things that had been said, right? That came out of the building. I will say this, just based on what David Tepper said today. He said that when we were sitting at 2, or then when we thought we could get to 2 and Houston would be picking at 1, then we thought that they would pick Bryce Young and we would pick CJ Stroud. So just take that, isolate that, right? We thought that we would be picking CJ Stroud if we got to 2. That was
because he fell.
Because
he fell.
Because who fell?
Because Stroud fell. Tepper said they went to 2 because they were okay taking CJ Stroud at 2 because they knew Bryce Young would go 1. But unanimously, they thought Bryce Young was the number 1 prospect. That's what they said.
No, and I'm okay with that. That's why I said just isolate the fact that they thought that Bryce Young was the number 1 prospect, that Houston would get the number 1 pick, right?
Yeah.
And that they would pick him. Somebody brought up a valid point to my earlier tweet today. They did it tonight. They said that Houston was at number 1 until Lovie Smith won that game against Chicago. So now we're going back into the 2022 season, before the draft. Before the offseason, before we trade up, before any of that stuff is speculated. When we fired Matt Rule and we were planning on finding our quarterback of the future going back to last season, everybody thought that the Houston Texans would hold the number 1 pick. The best player in college football was Bryce Young. David Tepper told us today that they believed that Houston would pick Bryce Young. So Carolina's thought was if Houston, who needs a quarterback, ends up with the first pick, they're going to pick Bryce Young. So I know internally, Tepper and Fitterer and anybody who had any control in that building was saying, we got to get to number 2 because Houston won't move off of number 1. So if we get to number 2, who are we going to pick? We're going to pick CJ Stroud, right? And I imagine that was the case all the way through December, all the way through the new year when CJ Stroud came down and showed out against Georgia. And so when they hired Frank Reich, things had changed by then, I think, where now we know that Chicago holds the number 1 pick. And now there's this race to get to 2 or 1 if getting to 1 is possible. But again, whoever gets to 1 gets Bryce. Whoever can get to 2 likely gets CJ Stroud. So all I'm saying is this, and I won't go into the unanimous stuff, but just think about Ricky, Bryce, Curtis. I don't know about you because you're erratic. But Bryce and Ricky, you're Frank Reich. Right now, you feel very confident that you can get to 2. And if you get to 2, who's our guy?
CJ Stroud.
CJ Stroud. Now, for the first 2-3 weeks doing interviews, first 2 or 3 weeks, maybe a month or so into the job, that's all I can bank on as the head coach of this team, is that I'm gonna have the opportunity to work with who? CJ Stroud. So I don't know that we can get to 1. I'm the head coach, and I'm planning for what I think we can do based on what the owner has told me, based on what Scott Fitter has told me. Pretty confident we can get to number 2, right? And we can draft CJ Stroud. Knowing that that was the natural fit for Frank Reich, in my mind, knowing that that was discussed because David Tepper told us that today, I think Frank Reich had really kind of accepted the idea that he was going to get to work with a CJ Stroud. I think when they called to Chicago, Ryan Poles said, send DJ Moore, because, that wasn't all overnight. That was, give us Brian Burns. Now we don't want to give up Brian Burns. Then we got to have DJ Moore. All that stuff was happening, and it's whatever span of time it took to make it happen, it took that time. But now Frank Reich is sitting back thinking like, oh crap, like, so what's the plan if we go to number 1? Is it, am I going to have to pivot off of CJ for Bryce, right? And I can get okay with that, but it might take me some time. They made it happen. They got to 1, and we heard this all offseason. Frank Reich and Scott Fitterer, head coach, GM, they didn't talk about who they wanted until a week before the draft. And to me, I think that's BS. Even if it's true, I think it's BS. You got the most important decision in this franchise in the last decade, and you are unwilling or afraid to go and tell one another man to man who you're thinking. And I think the reason they should have did that is because I think it could have created some healthy discourse about what they were planning to do. Because what if they were off? What if Anthony Richardson was the guy that they really wanted? What if it was Will Levis? Like, they needed to have that discussion quicker than a week out, because it feels like, even best case, they got lucky that they agreed as the GM and the head coach, right? But what I think happened, speculation, David Tepper had gone to all these visits, to these pro days. You remember that whole, David Nicole and the whole entourage was going to Ohio State, to Tuscaloosa, to Kentucky, to see these guys, to Gainesville, to see these guys perform. They were taking them out to dinner, right? I think when Dave Tepper saw Bryce Young go through his 17-minute preparation situation, they all were sitting at the table like, oh my God, look at this guy. Like, this dude is different. And we've all been, if you hire somebody, you sat in interviews and you're just like, oh my God, like, you're the guy. You're the guy. And I think once Tepper let it be known who he wanted, let's go back to something I mentioned earlier. I think Frank Reich, being the softy that I think that he is, I hate to say that, I think he acquiesced and was like, well, let me find a way to like Bryce Young. Let me find, because then we start hearing things back in March. Well, I once rated Russell Wilson high. I think I had him higher than most. He was saying stuff like that, to let people know, like, hey, I know y'all been talking about the 6'4" thing, but hey, I like short guys too. Never coached one, but I like them too. I can like them.
Yeah, but he was being pigeonholed into that, dude, by the media. Like, the media was pigeonholing him in that.
But they were doing it because, look, man, we're not crazy. People do what they're comfortable doing. This is football. You don't see a guy who says, like, you won't see Greg Roman going out there running some, spread offense, passing the ball, because Greg Roman is a power run scheme guy, right? As an offensive play caller. People, they draft guys that they trust, and especially with the quarterback position. The quarterback position is based on trust. You're a head coach, you're a former quarterback. only trust the guys that can do the things that you want done in the offense that you design. I read something today that somebody shared with me about Frank Reich when he was in Philly and his penchant for going downfield as an offensive play caller, offensive designer. How many times did we throw downfield with Bryce Young? I mean, we couldn't protect, but at the same time, like, it don't even seem like anything was dialed up. Your guy, what's my man's name? QB coach, QB school, JT O'Sullivan.
JT O'Sullivan.
Yeah, Sullivan, yeah.
How many times have you showed us in our route combinations that things weren't even going past the sticks?
Right.
Nobody was going deep. It wasn't even designed to go deep. That's when I started thinking, you know what? Frank Reich, he may have became part of the consensus that made this unanimous pick to get Bryce. I won't doubt, like you said, I'll take him at his word, Ricky. If he says that, okay, I believe you. I don't believe you, but I'll accept
But I'll
it.
take it. Yeah.
I don't believe you, but I accept what you're telling me. But the proof is in the pudding. What he put on the field, the things that he trusted Bryce Young to attempt as his quarterback. What you heard today, you know, you needed him to read off of his play sheet, his wristband, versus getting it through his helmet, like, you know, like he preferred. The RPO thing, you know, we saw Bryce Young, like, he made his name in Alabama doing RPO. Frank Reich didn't let him do that in Carolina. And I'm thinking to myself, like, this can't be by accident. Like, Frank told us, and I'm gonna stop. I'm sorry, Curtis, but Frank Reich told us himself before the season, we have designed an offense specifically for Bryce Young. They said that. I heard him say that. Right?
That's what I was about to bring up and ask you is what's the timeline on them designing this playbook? Because I remember that same thing. And they said they gave Bryce the playbook early so that he could start understanding and start conceptualizing and start seeing what they were trying to do with it, right?
Yeah.
But if they did have an affinity for CJ or Anthony Richardson or anything like that, that playbook could not have been even remotely the same because those players are so vastly different, right? So either there's an incompetence on the building of a playbook for a specific player, or there is just I don't know, man. Like, what is the other reasoning for having such a disjointed playbook?
Well, I think the disjointed playbook came from this. I think you have, and y'all mentioned this before, but I think you had Thomas Brown coming from McVay's.
It's too many voices. I mean,
right?
It's that simple.
And Frank Reich is coming in from the scheme that he just used in Indianapolis for years, and probably taking things that he used with the Eagles with Peterson, and was like, look, these are my staple things that I have to have in my offense, right?
Yeah.
Thomas Brown is bringing the things that work for him in McVay's offense, right? And so they're saying, okay, what do you like from yours? What do I have to keep from mine? This is Frank Reich. And I think some things conceptually probably have some crossover.
Sure.
But I think some things are just totally like staunchly different conceptually. And I think for Frank, more than he admitted, kept much of his weight in the offense than he allowed for Thomas to incorporate. And one thing that I would point to is that I think it was what's my guy's name? Daniel Jeremiah. I think it was Daniel Jeremiah. I might have the wrong pundit, but they mentioned how the Carolina Panthers, we run 11 personnel, but in terms of pre-snap motion, we're like 29th in the league or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Which is Frank Reich's offense.
Frank Reich's offense from last year was similar to that in terms of pre-snap motion percentage. Whereas if you look at how much pre-snap motion the Rams run, it's like top 3, right?
Yep.
That's what Thomas Brown
a basic principle of their offense, and that's.
But another issue all of that, and they mentioned this tonight on that Steve Smith podcast, is the plays are taking so long to get into the huddle. You don't even have time to run motion.
Right.
So that's another thing. And with Bryce wanting it in his headset, that's taking longer Frank Reich is taking longer to get the play in, and then it's taking longer for Bryce Young to relay that to the team and the offense. And Frank Reich needed to just step up and say, Bryce, we're going to a wristband and you're going to deal with it. And Frank couldn't do that. And that was a problem. And they mentioned that tonight. That was a problem. Frank did not want to do hard coaching, and he needed to do that.
But
no,
see,
yeah, I agree. Go ahead, Ricky.
Oh, no, you're good. Go, JJ. I'll go after
you.
No,
I was thinking about that earlier. I was like, this is crazy because you got this young guy and you're trying to get him comfortable, right? You're losing football games. Like your offense is stagnant, it's slow, like you're only getting the snaps off right at the 1 second mark on the play clock, and it's consistent. And teams
gives a defensive advantage every snap.
Yeah, they have a defensive advantage because they know we're going to, when that thing hits one, we're going after him.
And they can't block us anyways.
They can't block us
anyways. And they do the offense because it was so generic. It was
and so it's all of that. There's no pre-snap motion.
Yep.
It's taking a long time to develop. I think it sucked for Bryce Young because Frank Reich probably is unwilling to do it. I'm just thinking maybe for him as a play caller I hate to be an ageist, but at 61 years old, he probably is thinking I can't get it out quick enough in order to get it to you, all the different things that they have to go through
variables,
terminology wise,
right,
to get it over to you for you to digest it and then spit it back out to the team.
Yep.
And so it's too slow for me, Bryce. I can't make it happen. Look at your wristband.
Right.
And Bryce is
that took what? It was week 4 or 5 when he got the wristband.
Yeah.
That should have been figured out in training camp. Why are we figuring this out 6 weeks into the season?
I'm gonna tell you my biggest flaw with Frank Reich, the development of Bryce Young, and and all of the things that you're mentioning. I think it's 3 things that they messed up on. One was it's like when you have this great high school player, at your high school, and you're the high school coach, and he gets so good that he gets beyond your coaching to where you're just man, you just go do your thing, right? Because you figured it out. You're the 5-star athlete. All the recruiters want to come and get you. All the scouts want to come and get you, whatever. I think with Bryce Young, after they drafted him, I hate to say it, but I think they were oh man, high processor, you're so smart. You just get it, right? And so we don't have to coach you hard because you retain so much information, you process so quickly. When we put you in live action, you're so calm. We don't have any worries about you, right? And the one thing that I think we messed up on in hindsight is that we were the first team, and it didn't sound crazy at the time, but I think in hindsight, I think it was a mistake. We were the first team to name our rookie quarterback as the starter without any real competition in camp. They just came out right and said, Bryce Young is our starting quarterback. It looked good, and it's right. That's why they drafted the guy. They had to play him.
I didn't have a big issue with that.
No. I said, I mean, at the time, I was like, well, at least they're decisive, right? It looked good. It felt good. But the reason I bring that up is because it was you don't know if he's really ready or not. And I think they prematurely assumed that he would be ready. They assumed that they didn't have to, figure things out with communication, with what he preferred versus what they wanted to do, how it would be in live action. And like you said, we went through 3 preseason games where he got some playing time, but they didn't get enough of it to realize this is not working. Right.
That was a gripe. There was the preseason. If you wanted to name him the starter, he should have gotten some valuable minutes and some reps playing the actual offense instead of this buttoned up secrecy stuff that you claim you're getting a competitive advantage with. I mean,
and obviously when I was complaining about that stuff in the preseason, everybody's like, "Oh, but Panthers culture is just
preseason, right?"
Well, and they kind of they pigeonholed themselves, and you brought it up, but they pigeonholed themselves of Bryce is going to be the starter week 1. You really can't go back to Andy Dalton because then you're admitting that you already took him out there or put him out there too early. So they pigeonholed themselves from the start. So you're right about. I want to get to something else because we got to get this thing rolling, moving a little bit. because we got to talk about a guy who we didn't get a question about him today. Joe Person tried right at the end, and that is Scott Fitterer. And I know I'm pretty sure across the board we're pretty consensus on this, but Bryson, let's start with you on Scott. How much blame does Scott Fitterer deserve?
Yeah, he missed in damn near every shot he had this offseason. Of course, I don't agree that he missed on the quarterback that a lot of people are saying, but almost everywhere else throughout the draft, throughout free agency, it was unsuccessful. They're not translating. I don't know if it was, coaching. Maybe that changes. Maybe DJ Johnson turns into a premier edge rusher. Now that Frank Reich's gone, I doubt it. But but yeah, I think that this team obviously has had some shortcomings, and I think it starts at the top, obviously with David Tepper, but under him, Scott Fitterer. I think that this scouting department, this front office needs a complete overhaul. And, it's unfortunate because I think Scott Fitterer is another guy that seems like a really nice guy, a really genuine guy, but we need assholes. We need somebody that is not afraid to stand on their opinion, or what the kids are saying nowadays, stand on business. And this is my opinion. This is how I feel, and you're not going to change it. And you're a billionaire. You are a businessman. You are not a football man. I've been in this world for longer than you have. This is my opinion based off of my experience. If I were to come into your world and into trading, into stocks, and tell you that you're wrong, how would you feel about that? And I think there's very few potential candidates this offseason, front office wise and head coaching wise, that can do that coming to Carolina. So I think Scott deserves a lot of this blame. Unfortunately, like I said, he seems like a really nice guy. We've talked to him, Curtis and I have, just in the stands, prior to games. Super nice guy, talks to fans, really seems like a personable dude. But I think that we've had enough of that in Carolina, and we need people that aren't afraid to voice their opinion and like I say, stand on business and really kind of just say, hey, this is the way it is. I don't care if you like it or not. It is what it is. We got a lot of issues in Carolina. I think starting with the offensive line, you're looking at potentially having to replace 3 of the 5 starters on the offensive line going into next year. Hopefully it's not that bad, but then you start there. Obviously you got to get Bryce some weapons. And what has Scott Fitterer shown the ability to do, especially offensive wise, to get talent around Bryce Young? You draft a wide receiver in the second round, Jonathan Mingo. The next 8 receivers to go after Jonathan Mingo are better than Jonathan Mingo is right now in the NFL. You got Tank Dell, who's obviously a stud in Houston for CJ Stroud. It's not like their offensive line is extremely talented, but they're being coached better. Their scheme is better. It fits with the personnel that they have, and that's just not the concept that we have in Carolina at this point. So I think Scott Fitterer, he's worn out his welcome in Carolina, and I think it's time to move on to a person that makes David Tepper uncomfortable. And I think he needs to realize him being uncomfortable is probably a good thing for this team, because he's been comfortable ever since he got here. And we have won, 30 games since he's been here in total. It's been unacceptable. This is a fan base. This is a proud fan base. This is a fan base that really enjoys a winning team. And we haven't won in so long. I forget what it feels like to be actually at the end of last year, we were technically in playoff contention, but because of Steve Wilkes. But generally, I forget what it feels like to be in playoff contention because of the lack of success we've had under David Tepper. So he needs to be uncomfortable. He needs to hire somebody that he will allow to make the football decisions and that will not allow him to interject and will stand up to him when maybe he does want people to stick up to him and put them on blast, but then they send it right back and put him on blast and really put him in his place. That's what we need in Carolina. And I was on here defending David Tepper earlier, but that's what David Tepper needs as a person that I think, has has tried to see it from both sides. That's really what he needs is somebody that can do that.
I think Scott Fitter, his biggest blunder, and he's had many. I mean, you can go down the list. Sam Darnold exercising taking the 5th-year option before he even played a snap. The Robbie Anderson contract, letting Stephon Gilmore walk, letting Hassan Reddick walk, signing Dante Jackson to a bigger deal, signing Ian Thomas right off the bat to a bigger deal, going out and your first free agents were Cam Irving and God knows who the other one was. It's escaping me. But Pat Elflein. But one of the biggest blunders, and I think this is the biggest, is you were offered a massive trade for Brian Burns last year. You declined it. And then this year, don't sign him to a long-term contract. Like, no, across the league, he is a laughing stock for that decision alone. And I've had fans tell me, what the hell is this guy doing with that decision? And that is the biggest one. And it's still ongoing. We do not know at this point. And it sounds like it's going to come to a head with a franchise tag, whoever this next GM is, because I don't think Scott Fitter will last until at the end of the season. I think he's gone. But I think that was the biggest blunder for him and is laughable at this point. And you see all these other players going on to other teams. I mean, Rasul Douglas played very well in Green Bay. You look at Christian McCaffrey, traded away, is dominating in San Fran. You look at DJ Moore.
MVP candidate.
You look at DJ Moore and his success. If you look at now hindsight's 2020, they should have never got Christian McCaffrey, and they didn't need to get rid of Christian McCaffrey because you know what? They could have used the 2nd-round pick they had last year at 39 to give to Chicago, and Bryce Young would have Christian McCaffrey sit in his lap. And I know, JJ, I know you've had your qualms about McCaffrey, but we'd at least have an offensive weapon besides Bryce Young right now. So that's just another thing. And then and just to double down on the Brian Burns thing, if you didn't want to trade him then, why didn't you trade him this offseason when the Bears wanted, or when you wanted to move up to the 1st-round pick, and you would have kept Bryce Young's number 1 target and DJ Moore? So all of that compounded together is a total disaster, and he should have been fired the minute he didn't trade Brian Burns away for all those picks. And then this offseason, and I think Samir Suleiman has a lot to do in this too. His hand is in this too, is not signing Brian Burns to a long-term contract and turning this situation on its head is ridiculous. And the guy's a pillar of this franchise and he should have been locked up way in May or even June, whatever you want to call it, put a date on it. But massive blunder by him. That guy needs to be the next one gone. And honestly, I thought he should have been fired before Frank Reich. But Ricky, go ahead.
Well, real quick. Sorry, Ricky. I thought for sure you were going to say the biggest blunder was taking J.C. Horn over Pat Surtain, the number 2 consensus corner over the number 1 consensus.
And we're not. I haven't even gotten to the draft. You bring up a good point. What number 1 pick? And I think he's hit on Bryce Young because I do think Bryce Young long term is going to be a really good quarterback in this league. But what number 1 pick has he hit on since he's drafted?
Yeah,
and I will give him some credit because, again, they drafted Ike Ekwonu with the mindset Matt Rule was going to be the coach and they were going to run the ball and run this power scheme. That changed this year. So Ike Ekwonu does not fit the scheme right now with Frank Reich. And that was when they drafted Ike, that was their mindset. He was going to be the left tackle under Matt Rule's offense. Obviously, that entire thing has changed. He does not fit this scheme. So that one I can see, but you mentioned J.C. Horn. I mean, they passed on Micah Parsons. They passed on Surtain. There's many guys that they passed on, and we won't even get into the later rounds because he has not hit on a day 2, day 3, or day 4, or how many days there are in the draft. I think there's 3 at this point. I don't even know, but he hasn't hit on those picks either. You could maybe say the best one of his day 2 picks was Brady Christensen or Jeremy Chin. Maybe. Maybe.
I mean, all of them are reaches, but I mean, I won't even get into. I wait my turn.
Go ahead, Ricky.
Yeah. So I'll take a little bit from what you're saying, right? As far as like Icky and where he is here and not being a hit, that also plays into what the strategy should have been this draft, right? And we can look at just this draft because we could talk about Mingo, and you could talk about when you get a different coach and you're putting in a different offensive scheme with a different zone blocking and different philosophy and different objectives to that offense. Then you have to have a plan, and you have to have personnel that can execute that plan. And I understand that you took Icky 6 overall, so you're not going to abandon that ship right away, right? In year 2. I understand that. I'm not asking for that. I'm not advocating for it. But what you could do is you could get some sort of reinforcement in the draft to back him up that actually fits that system differently and could be a player that in training camp can push Icky to do certain things and to show Icky what he is lacking in and to make it an actual competition instead of just saying, well, look, he was a 6 overall pick last year. He's going to play. We have no option of it. You talk about it being a meritocracy is what Frank said multiple times, right? He was like, people have to earn their right to play this. I don't buy into it because it seems like you kind of just took players that you felt kind of good about and that you got sandbagged into keeping, whatever it may be, and you just gave it to them based off of title and draft value is the way that it seems. You talk about Jonathan Mingo and how it could have been Tank Dell. It should have been, or it should have been any of them that can create separation on their own. And I'm not a Jonathan Mingo hater. I like Jonathan Mingo in a certain situation and used in a certain role. I think he does have value, and I think he does have traits that can absolutely translate into a productive NFL player. But what he is not is an individual one-on-one winner on the quick pass game. And that is exactly what you were trying to implement if you're talking about bringing Thomas Brown and elements of the McVay, Shanahan, whatever offense hybrid that you're trying to run here. It is a zone blocking scheme in running, like almost completely. And that is what Bobby Slowick in Houston does as well, right? It is a zone blocking scheme, and it is based on the quick pass game. And most of it is under center. So if you know all of these things conceptually, and you have this vision and you compose this playbook as they claim they did and sit down in this collaborative, monumental effort, then why did you go through this entire personnel process without putting those pieces in place? And I'm sorry, but I'm going to be very simple about this. What is Scott Fitterer's job title? He's a general manager of a football team, right? What are the responsibilities of a general manager of a football team? It is personnel. It is salary cap. It is acquisitions, right? It is all of those things that fall directly there. We can talk about Tepper meddling all we want to, and I'm not discrediting that. But Scott Fitterer has a job, and he has a job to perform. And up to this point, there has been nothing but excuses why he hasn't been able to do that on his own. And then this year, if you want to just grade it on 1 year alone, this is the year that he was said to have the reins. He missed on every single pick except for Bryce Young. And Bryce Young is something that people will debate on if he hit or not, because you're going to point to CJ Stroud, whether it's fair, whether it's using context or not. Everyone will point to CJ Stroud, and rightfully so, and say he is balling out of his mind out there in Houston. And Houston was a bottom-dwelling franchise that actually earned their second overall pick. They didn't trade up to get it. So there is a lot of elements that play against Scott Fitterer, and you look at every single pick, man, and it is a miss. You look at trade acquisitions, they haven't panned out. Retreads of quarterbacks haven't panned out. The entire philosophy of Scott Fitterer as a GM seems extremely flawed, in my opinion. And if it's outside things that are bringing collusion into it and he's not able to perform his job, then I still think he should be relieved. Like, there's not a saving grace for him, to be completely honest, man. There is not a redeemable quality to what we have seen in his years here.
JJ, fire away.
Well, just taking a slightly different approach, but consistent with who I've always been and what I've always said about a good football team. You have to have alignment from the owner to the GM to the head coach, and honestly, sometimes down to the quarterback. I think Scott Fitterer was brought in for a purpose, and that purpose was to be paired with Matt Rule, because Matt Rule had roster control, or at least that's what they say, is that Matt Rule had final say on the roster. And there were some pretty good candidates when they interviewed Scott Fitterer. And Scott Fitterer, if I remember correctly, he came at the very end, out of nowhere.
Yep.
Adam Peters was rumored to be, one of the favorites, and even I believe Ben Allwright
And Ryan
back
Poles
at
as
that
well.
time. Who was that?
Ryan Poles interviewed as well
Yeah,
before it was
Ryan
interested.
Poles, was a young stud coming from Kansas City.
Yep.
They had some really highly qualified candidates. I remember Ed Dodds was a really popular name during that cycle, and he pulled himself out and went back to Indy. The reason I think Ed Dodds did that, and I'm not 100% sure, but a reason I think, well, let's just keep it on Scott Fitterer. The reason I think they decided on Scott Fitterer was because, and they even said this, because of his history of working in collaborative environments like they had in Seattle with the dynamics between Pete Carroll and Snyder, right? Scott Fitterer had seen an environment where the coach and the GM collaborated, and they knew that Matt Rule had control here, and basically they needed for somebody to come and be a facilitator to acquire players, to draft players that Matt Rule wanted on his team, right? Year one, the biggest splash they made in year one of Scott Fitterer wasn't in the draft. It was a free agent that Matt Rule had ties to, and that was Hassan Reddick, right? So early on, it started out okay because you was like, man, Hassan Reddick, that could be something, and it was something. They drafted J.C. Horn that year. We won't talk about the people that they passed over, but it could have been Justin Fields. It could have been Pat Surtain at that same position of need. I was a big Micah Parsons guy, but people were saying that he was, you shouldn't draft a linebacker in the first round. Crazy. Anyway, the reason why you need to move on from Scott Fitterer is because in my vision of having an aligned football staff and team and culture, and you said this earlier, Ricky, having guys who have the same vision for what they want to build, the type of players they need to play the scheme that's going to be coached on both sides of the football, guys who fit the culture. Scott Fitterer was brought in to marry Matt Rule and his culture. When Matt Rule got fired, Scott Fitterer should have went out the door with him because those two people were in alignment. As a matter of fact, I've heard Scott Fitterer even say as recent as this draft or this offseason, he still gives Matt Rule praise for some of the things that they did together, right? He was Matt Rule's guy. He essentially was Matt Rule's hire, not Dave Tepper's hire. He was brought in to be compatible with Rule, right? And so in the past, when we want to criticize Scott Fitterer for some of the decisions that he made to go out and get Donald to trade those 3 picks for Donald to then come back the next year and trade up to get Matt Corral, right? In the same year, go trade for Baker Mayfield, right? More draft equity that you lose. And then, and I hate to say it because let me clear the air about Bryce Young. I do not think he is the wrong pick, right? CJ Stroud's success is making it look like he could be perceived as a miss by the greater masses of football fans, including Southern Carolina, and me on most days. But he has an opportunity for success, and this is where I'm going to pivot on Scott Fitterer. Bryce Young is not a lost cause. It doesn't matter if CJ Stroud is going to be better than him or not. I mean, Baker Mayfield went number 1 in 2018. Josh Allen is light years ahead of him. Lamar Jackson might be better than all of them. He went 32, right? I think the situation with Bryce Young this year is akin to Jared Goff going to the Rams and Wentz, I think, went second to Philly. I believe it happened that way. And I believe Wentz had more success early than Jared Goff did, right? But if you look today, kind of like the same example that you used earlier, Curtis, Goff is having a lot of success in this league, in the offense that fits him. Wentz had injury and everything that kind of threw his career off. But right now, I would say Goff is a more successful story than Wentz has been in his career, right? Doesn't matter how you start.
Right.
It's in the NFL, it's about longevity, especially at the quarterback position.
Mhm.
And you got to be consistent. And I think Bryce has an opportunity to be a high-performing quarterback in the NFL. He may not ever be elite. And I think this is something, not to get on him, but this is something that we have to focus on when it comes to the GM position and Scott Fitterer in this conversation. Based on his history, based on his 2023 draft and his free agent acquisitions, based on his 2022 draft and the things that he's done on the offensive side of the football, going back to Terrace Marshall, that was an offensive pick, Tommy Tremble, Brady Christensen, Shi Smith, Chuba Hubbard, those guys, Deontay Brown. Do you trust the guy that picked those guys to build an offense for Bryce Young? That's what it comes down to for Scott Fitterer. When you look at Scott Fitterer's, the highlights of his resume pre-Carolina, what would you think is the most distinct thing that he did for Seattle, like in terms of building that team? What stands out about that Seattle team and their run?
Defense.
Legion of Boom.
You would say Legion of Boom. Yeah, right.
And he was very young in his career when they drafted those guys. So I don't know how much influence he had on finding Richard Sherman in the 5th round, or drafting Earl Thomas and Cam Chancellor and all those guys. Right. He can't take credit for that. They built very little around Russell Wilson offensively, and they acquired Marshawn Lynch from the Buffalo Bills. That was a pro personnel move. It wasn't a scout move, right? So, and that team, until Russ let Russ cook Russ, was built around Marshawn Lynch in that run game and the things they could do off of it and what Russ could do with his legs. And Russ was a good quarterback. He became a really good quarterback. But Scott Fitterer in Seattle never really built a great offense and had great offensive skill players on that team until recently, since Scott Fitterer has been in Carolina. So we can't give Scott Fitterer credit at any level, at any point in his history, for building an offense and skill players around a quarterback. Even in Seattle, when they were at their best with Russell Wilson, their offensive line struggled in pass pro. That's his history. That's just who he is, and it's really who he isn't. So if Carolina is going to be serious about finding the right type of head coach to lead this team, number one, but to bring the infrastructure to really develop Bryce Young and make him the best quarterback he possibly can be, you can't trust this GM with his past history to build the roster around this quarterback. You just can't. There's no evidence that he can, and that's the reason why he can't run from the blame of where we are on this roster. You got to look at how many picks was wasted, and people might look at, it's just a second, a fourth, and a sixth, and then it was a trade up, for Matt Corral, from the fourth and the future third, and whatever. But like all of those are opportunities. And when you look at good rosters, you look at somebody like in San Francisco, Fred Warner, 3rd round pick, George Kittle, 5th round pick. You got dogs, around the league who's being picked in the 5th and 6th round. The guy in Dallas, Bland, I just found out he was a 5th round pick for the Cowboys. Like, if they're a 5th round pick in Carolina, they'll be lucky to be on the roster or in the NFL in 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Scott Fitterer,
not wrong with that.
Yeah, Scott Fitterer, not even him, the Carolina Panthers, David Tepper, at some point, he's going to have to go with what's going on around the league and say, hey, look, man, Scott, I tried you out. I wanted it to work with Rule and you. It didn't. I gave you an extra shot to prove yourself, kind of like he gave Hurney after he got rid of Rivera. Just like it didn't work with Hurney.
I wanted to bring him up while you're talking about him. I don't mean to cut you off, but
Go ahead. No,
I
I'm good.
heard this in the spaces, and I don't know if we have time for this, and we really don't, but I'll just throw it out there. Was Marty Herney a better GM than Scott Fitter? But
Absolutely.
you guys can on, because he at least hit on first round picks.
Yeah, he was hitting on something.
Yeah, I mean, he absolutely is, and it's not just because he hit on first round picks. I think Herney had a better vision for the teams that he was working with. I don't think he always got it right, but I think he understood, like how to get top talent when top talent was required, right? And so, like, if I get a first round pick, I mean, you look at what happened in 2020. He picked Derek Brown. Like the Panthers the year before were like historically bad in the run defense, like 32nd in rushing touchdowns given up, like a record TDs given up, rushing TDs, and we couldn't stop the run for anything. So he got Derek Brown, but the crazy part is he wanted Herbert. Mm-hmm. And even though I wasn't a big Herbert fan at that time, I didn't see the vision. Herney did. And a lot of other evaluators didn't see the vision either. So you got to give credit to the Chargers, who knew him well. And honestly, if the Chargers didn't pick Herbert, he would be a Panther, right? And that's the one that got away for Herney. Many didn't get away from Herney. And you don't get a lot of chances to second guess his picks. Of the last, 5 first round picks we've had, 2 of them were Marty Herney's, and 3 of them were Scott Fitter's, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Out of the 5, who are the only 2 that you probably would say that would get a future contract with the Panthers?
Well, Bryce Young is.
No.
He's talking about the Herney ones?
Talking about today.
No, I got you.
The only ones that would get them for sure is
Burns and Brown.
Burns situation and Brown. Those were Herney picks, right?
Yep.
And so I don't know if the other guys get picked up. Bryce is to be determined.
Well, let's transition here because I got 2 more things I want to talk about, and we got to try to wrap this up because this episode is going to take forever to edit. But real quick on this, and I'll start with Ricky. We'll go to Bryson then. Why Chris Tabor at interim head coach?
For me, it's kind of twofold, right? Chris Tabor has done a good job with his unit. I don't think that that's something to just completely dismiss. I think that special teams has been consistent. I think they've been very solid. And I think that it allows consistency through a period of transition. When you get rid of the head coach, I think that you want to keep some semblance of normalcy within the locker room and for the players' sake. And I think that Evero continuing to be the defensive play caller and that be his focus is being the defensive coordinator and calling plays on the defensive side of the ball, because Evero is probably the candidate that I would have either assumed would take over that position, the interim position, or was the most qualified based on the performance this year. I think that Evero has been the best coach on the Panthers roster this year, or on the staff. But I think that not putting him in a position where you create another jackpot for Tepper potentially, right? And I think that he did this intentionally. I think that he knew that he got himself into an absolute jackpot last year with Steve Wilks, talking about he's going to have to do something miraculous to keep this job, or he's going to have to do something extraordinary to keep this job. He did something extraordinary, and he should have kept the job. But what he was doing when he said that is he was basically saying, look, man, I'm not going to give you this job. You're going to have to win a Super Bowl to get this job, right? And if you don't win the Super Bowl, I can always say, hey, yeah, but somebody else finished better than you. And I'm going to have an out. And he's going to do whatever he wants to do because that's his thing, right? He's a slick guy, like JJ already alluded to earlier. He's very slick and purposeful in the things that he says and the actions that he does without it being like blatant and obvious and on the surface. Thomas Brown, I don't think that that's a viable option because of the fact that they've already seen him get the play call taking away from him. Now you're giving it back to him. Let him focus on that. Like, honestly, you would be doing a detriment, I think, to Thomas Brown by trying to put more on his plate when he deserves the decency to get this job and to do this job that he was supposed to have from the beginning. That doesn't mean that Thomas isn't qualified to get head coaching interviews and looks in the future. He is, man. And I think that he's got that leader of men quality that everybody looks for in a head coach. But I think keeping them at the post that they're at and allowing them to do that and not putting any more damage at their feet at the end of this season. There is no interim record that will be tied to them based off of this football team. Chris Tabor, I'm not calling him like a scapegoat by any means. It's just like letting him be the sacrificial lamb. He earned his right to do this too, and he's happy about the opportunity. He said that in the presser. But it just keeps things a little bit cleaner, I think, because I don't think that you want to sully the resumes of Thomas Brown and Evero. And I'm not saying that they were done a solid by David Tepper in this situation or Scott Fitterer, but I think that it makes a little bit more sense to me.
All right, Bryson, before we get to that, because I think Ricky nailed that one on the head, and I think we all would probably say the same damn thing you were about to say. So I'm going to end on this. And I know you guys, I don't know if Ricky has prepared this. I know Bryson has already tweeted about this. I know JJ has talked about it. So let's just go cut to the chase. Your head coach wish list. You don't got to make it long. Give me your top 3, 4, whatever you want to do. Bryson, let's start with you.
Yeah, I've gone back and forth with this. I think for Carolina specifically, it's been since Matt Rule. They want the play caller. They want the offensive mind. They want the person that's gonna reinvigorate the offense in Carolina that hasn't been here for years. But I think this season is a justification of needing someone that can build a roster. And I think paired with a GM, obviously, that's something that they're going to have to do, in collaboration with each other. But I think number one overall, I think it's pretty consensus. Ben Johnson, who would be the play caller, who is the up and coming, probably the hottest candidate. Tom Pelissero went on the Mac and Bone show today and stated that he didn't turn down the job in Carolina because he didn't want the job in Carolina. It was solely based on his loyalty to Detroit and wanting to go back and give another chance to make a run at the Super Bowl in Detroit. Former Tar Heel, played football in, I think, Asheville area. Yeah, in Carolina. I mean, he's from here. I think that's probably the home run hit, but pretty much the guy I was alluding to as the roster builder is a guy I know JJ and I kind of have some we see eye to eye on is Jim Harbaugh. And that's a guy that has a proven track record in the NFL, coached the 49ers, his record 49-22 when he was in the NFL, NFC championships. Colin Kaepernick, quarterback, obviously coached him to take that team to multiple NFC championships. Has proven every single stop he's been at that he wins and that he changes cultures. And a story that I heard of him on another podcast I listened to, he got to Stanford. When he got to Stanford, his one of his first meetings he had with the players, he told them that they're stopping all traditions at Stanford because they're losers, and he doesn't know if the traditions that they have been practicing are attributing to them being losers. That is what we need in Carolina. Hands down, that is what we need. So I think either way you go here, Ben Johnson or Jim Harbaugh, I think both of those hires would be great for this team. Obviously, Ben Johnson's a little bit more of a question, in my opinion, because he hasn't been a head coach. He's been an offensive coordinator for going on. He'll complete 2 years after this season. He is one of the hottest candidates because of the innovations and the offense that he runs in Detroit. He's been one of the best play callers in the league since he's taken over as a play caller. But Jim Harbaugh has the proven acumen as a head coach. He is not liked, and there's a reason he's not liked. Is because he not necessarily is stuck in his ways in a bad way, but he stands on business, as I've been saying throughout this whole thing. And he is the one person I believe that would put David Tepper in his place and not care one single bit about what David Tepper has to say. So Ben Johnson, Jim Harbaugh, and then, I think third, Bobby Slowick. Obviously, we've talked about him a little bit. The things he's doing with C.J. Stroud in Houston, spectacular in his first year. I think coming from that McVay tree, I think he'd be a potential candidate here in Carolina as well.
Yeah, I tweeted this out yesterday because I got to get out in front of this because that's what we're all doing these days. It seems like Ben Johnson, Ben Johnson, Ben Johnson. I think that is and should be the pick wholeheartedly. I will not forget, and I'll keep bringing this up and ride this until it happens. When I talked to David Tepper on the sideline before a game last year, it was the Detroit game, and before the game, and I asked him, who you guys looking at a head coach? And he did not even mention Steve Wilkes' name when they were having such success. And he said, look at the guy over there on the other sideline. He was talking about Ben Johnson. It was clear at that point that's who he wanted. It's funny that Tom Pelissero comes out and says that. I said that a couple of weeks ago that I didn't buy. Everyone kept saying, well, Ben Johnson turned down the Panthers. I wasn't buying that. I don't think that was the case. And Tom Pelissero confirmed that today. So I think that would be my number one pick. I think Bryce Young, as JJ mentioned, fits that mold of Jared Goff, a distributor to Ben Johnson's offense. I think Ben Johnson is out of this world creative when it comes to play calling. Watch what he's done week in and week out. I mean, he's game planning for plays quarters in advance of the play that he wants, setting things up. And I think that's what Carolina needs on this offensively. So that's number one. I will not back down from that. Ben Johnson is my number one pick. I do like Jim Harbaugh. I do agree with what Bryson said. I think that would also be another good pick. Bobby Slowick comes to mind too, an innovator on offense. And something I think there was, I don't know if Bryson, you might have shared this today, someone on Twitter, but Bobby Slowick's infatuation with Bryce Young, I think that obviously would be a good pairing. I also like Brian Flores is like a sleeper. I think that guy could command, and I think would be someone like a Steve Wilkes, and you would see an instant identity. I know it's a defensive-minded guy, but I do like what he's done in his stints on the defensive side of the ball. So that was another kind of sleeper guy I like. But those are my top four. Ricky, what do you got?
I hate to just go chalk here on the first guy, but I really do like Ben Johnson. And it's for every reason that you guys just mentioned, but it's also the approach that he has on the offensive side too, of the run game still matters a whole lot. He's not falling in love with this air it out type of idea that a lot of people seem to think that the new NFL is running into, right? It's why he went and got David Montgomery. They drafted Jahmyr Gibbs and he was like, yeah, but I still need I need my bruiser. I need my actual between the tackles running back that when we get within the 10-yard line, I'm going to hand it to him twice at least. And I'm going to see what we can do. And he keeps a defense honest by having that at your disposal. He also really emphasizes offensive line play. We know that he can utilize a tight end. He's got a good eye for how to incorporate what his players do well. He's the epitome, and this is something that we talked about earlier with the drawing up a playbook, and what I have a qualm about the whole way that this was done in Carolina. You scheme to a player, not a player to a scheme, right? And I think that that's exactly what Ben Johnson is capable of doing, is that he takes every bit of talent that he has at his disposal and he figures out how to get the most out of it. So I love that from an offensive side. As far as him never ever being a head coach, he's learning how to do the rah-rah part of the job from Dan Campbell. I don't know that there's that many better active head coaches to teach you the rah-rah component of being a head coach and commanding a locker room than Dan Campbell. You know what I mean? So I think that he is getting some serious experience there with that. I'd be very comfortable with him being the number one overall choice. So real quick about Harbaugh, I like him a lot, man, and I don't discredit what you guys are saying about him being able to build a culture and change something dramatically in a quick amount of time. My only trepidation and my only hang up on Harbaugh is when we talk about the stubbornness of older people in the older side of football, right? And I'm not trying to put him in that same category, because you also got guys like Pete Carroll and Andy Reid that are older dudes, and they don't seem to fall into that, right? So there's always exceptions to that rule, and Harbaugh may be able to do that. But my trepidation is just on the offensive side. I hope that he would be able to come up with an offense in the NFL that would work the way that the last one did for him with Colin Kaepernick, because his offense is at Michigan, and I'm going to be completely transparent here about this. I'm not a huge Big Ten person. I'm a Maryland fan. and I don't watch a ton of Maryland football because it's Maryland football. So I'm just going to be like real honest about that and say that I'm not super familiar with what he does at Michigan, but I do know that he always seems to end up at the end of the year with an offense that has quarterback situation that just never really plays to the potential of what the prospect is talked about from an outside perception is how I'll phrase that. But so my other two that I will say, though, I really like Mike McDonald, man, the defensive coordinator out of Baltimore. I really like him, and it ties in for me a little bit. Now, he was a defensive coordinator at Michigan under Harbaugh. Like him, he was with Baltimore Ravens for a really long time, working as an assistant. I think that he's got connections with a lot of the GM candidates that I would be interested in. And again, when we talked about a cohesive vision, I really want, and I know that this is something that JJ has mentioned on Twitter, I've seen talking about the Adam Peters and the Bobby Slowick vision. I really like the idea of a cohesive vision between the GM and the head coach that align from their history of what they know works in the NFL, but works in a modern way. Like they have seen it recently, and that is what they would incorporate, and they're together on that. So I really like Mike McDonald a lot. I kind of like Jim Caldwell, man, to be completely honest. I think that if you struggle to get Ben Johnson and maybe you're unsure of what to do, there are way worse contingency plans than Jim Caldwell, who you already have in the building and that has proven to win. And I think is also a guy that can develop a real identity in the locker room and on the team. So I would 100% advocate for him as well. Those would be my three that I would throw out.
Ricky,
JJ?
let me ask you.
Ricky,
let me ask you about one candidate, just because I know you know ball. So Frank Smith, the offensive coordinator for the Dolphins.
Don't steal my thunder, man.
Oh, JJ. Okay, all right. Go ahead. Questions for you then.
Yeah, let JJ get that one.
Frank Smith.
Well, I'm going to
I like Frank.
I'll segue into my list, and then I'll get to him because I mentioned him earlier as my dark horse.
Okay.
So my list, it begins with Ben Johnson. And this goes back to Curtis last year, actually, because he was high on Ben Johnson last year. I'm right with that, right, Curtis? Wasn't it you?
And Bryson.
Yeah. So I remember, you guys made me pay a little bit more attention to Ben Johnson, and I started looking at his history, like Bryson mentioned. He's kind of the whole two states, one team. He's born in Charleston, went to high school in Nashville, went to UNC. And then, he just exploded on the scene last year. And I actually think he's better this year than he was last year as a play caller.
Would agree.
So he's growing, right? He's ascending.
It's a great sign.
And I think he's better prepared to be a coach this year than he would have been if we would have got him last year. So I think a big thing, and y'all cleared this up with Ben Johnson based on some of the tweets and stuff that came out today. I know one thing is different about the Carolina situation this year versus when we would have wanted to interview him last year. Is that last year, when we wanted to interview him, we held the 9th pick, right? This year, when we interview him, hopefully, he knows he has Bryce Young. So he comes in knowing who my quarterback would be, and he can start developing and devising a plan to sell David Tepper on how he's going to elevate this young man, the type of players that he's going to put around him, and how that will look based on what he's done with a similar guy in Jared Goff, right? So I think for that reason, he's number one because, one, I know Tepper wants him. Two, I think he's proven on the field why he should be that guy. He does a lot of the things, and this is the cool thing I like about him. He does a lot of things that the Shanahan guys do without being a Shanahan guy, right? So I think he gives you something unique in that. Like he may one day start his own tree.
Yeah.
So that's my first guy. My second guy is Slowick. We've already talked about that. I think Slowick because if everything is true about what David Tepper thought and what the rest of the NFL thought when they held the number 1 pick before losing it, we all heard that the Texans were going to draft Bryce Young. So that tells me that Slowick was in place and he was devising a plan and a scheme for Bryce Young. So nobody should have more notes on who Bryce Young is as a player than Bobby Slowick as a potential head coach here in Carolina. So I think that person would come in and also have a great plan to share with David Tepper about what he can do with Bryce Young, how much he believes in him based on the film from Alabama, and probably some of the things that they did with him this year. And so I think that would be a really good pairing. Number 3, I always say this, I would never have a head coach candidate list without having Jim Harbaugh on it. Y'all spoke to a lot of the things that, the reasons why I would want him in Carolina. But the main thing is Jim Harbaugh, he builds a tough culture. It's very serious. It's a tough-minded football culture. It's power football on offense. It's tough-nosed defense. It's ugly sometimes, but most times it wins. And, he's not very good with the media. He's very short-answered. And he's crass, and a lot of times people don't like him because of the way he's interacting. But I kind of like that part about it, right? And, everybody gives him credit for what he did with Colin Kaepernick. But being a person who followed that team at that time, when Colin Kaepernick took over, I hated it because I had been waiting for Alex Smith to become Alex Smith. And Jim Harbaugh got Alex Smith to become the best version of Alex Smith before Andy Reid got him. And so you went with a guy who was a number 1 overall pick, had struggled in an offensive situation out there in San Francisco, couldn't really figure it out. And it was something that Jim Harbaugh did that a lot of people who didn't watch the 49ers, they didn't see, but I saw. Go back and look at the footage. Before every game, and sometimes before like critical drives, Harbaugh would go to Alex Smith and start patting him on the shoulder pads and like rally him up and get him like ready to go for the moment. And Alex Smith is, if y'all seen Alex Smith, really laid back guy, game manager type. I think Harbaugh said, you may not believe you're a winner, but I'm going to make you believe you're a winner. And I think it changed Alex Smith's trajectory for the remaining years of his career. He ended up losing that position to Colin Kaepernick, but I trusted Alex Smith more at the time when he lost that job than I did Colin Kaepernick taking the job from him. And, just to the point of, Alex Smith and what he did with him, he actually took Alex Smith to the first NFC championship, just lost it. So I think Jim Harbaugh, to Ricky's, concern, I do have concerns about what kind of offense he would build because his success came with Greg Roman at the NFL level. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that fits Bryce Young. I think that type of offense would protect Bryce Young. But I don't think Bryce Young
would ever develop him and get him like the most out of him, right?
Yeah, it wouldn't maximize him.
Right.
It would make him more of a game manager. But the Carolina Panthers could win with that type of Bryce Young too.
Right.
It's just what we or how we, would shape our expectation for who Bryce Young should be in Carolina. Do we want him to be a winner or do we want him to be a top 5 quarterback? And if you prefer a winner versus top 5, they'll think that pairing could work. But he would be my number 3. But just for the culture setting more than anything else. And then Frank Smith. Bryce, you had just asked about him. I always try to look for guys who haven't been discovered yet. I found Mike McDaniel 2 years ago, and I knew that when he got an opportunity, he was going to be good. Frank Smith is now Mike McDaniel's his offensive coordinator, and the thing about Frank Smith that's a little unlike the rest of the guys in that Shanahan tree is that I think his most significant growth came with his time from Sean Payton. I think he started with Sean Payton in New Orleans. And he's been able to be exposed to different head coaches and learn different ways of leading. And what I read about him is that he's very adaptable to the players around him. And he finds a way to get these guys motivated and to want to play and to have fun playing football. And I think he's a little more of an unknown in regards to like what a scheme looks like. But I know some of the schemes that he has been exposed to and what he's working with down there now with Tua and what the Dolphins do with McDaniel. I think some of that can translate to Bryce Young. Mm-hmm. And so knowing who our owner is and how he likes to be the first to the new thing, I think Frank Reich is the name that you're going to see rising up boards that you're not hearing about now, or you're starting to hear about him now. But he was the guy that I found like a few days ago, even before we fired Frank Reich, just to try to get ahead of who might be those guys. And I think Frank Smith is going to be, if not this year, he'll be the hot name next cycle. I just want Carolina to at least explore him, because I think he would have, in addition to his skill set as a play caller, I think he might be able to bring a sense of leadership based on who he's been around in his past. That adds to, his understanding of offensive football. And that's something that I really don't know if other guys have yet or not. Like what Ricky mentioned about Ben Johnson. The one question I had about him last year was like, can he lead men? But he is getting good mentoring based on, who he's around now. So it makes sense that he might be able to do that. Everybody has different energy. But I know for sure one of the things I read about Frank Smith is that he has great energy.
And that's the same question you'd have for Bobby Slowick, right? Because Bobby Slowick, this is his first time in a coordinator position. How does that translate over to a head coach? And are we asking too much of a hotshot young coordinator to come in, continue calling the plays, and also take over the responsibilities of being a head coach of a football team?
No,
that's a lot to ask.
But I think it goes. I think to Ben Johnson's credit is he was smart enough last year to interview at a couple spots and say, "Hey, I'm not ready yet."
Yeah,
absolutely.
And the degrees he's got, I think, is something like aerodynamic. Like this guy is very intelligent.
Yeah.
And for him to realize that, because we all know it, if he would have got on that plane, like Tom Pelissero said, and went into Charlotte, Tepper was throwing the bag at him last year, and he would have gotten the job. So for him to realize that and say, hey, I'm not ready, and also I have unfinished business in Detroit, I think that says a lot about him.
No, and that's why I have him at number one now, because at first I was like, did he really go back for another year's offensive coordinator? But now when I look at the results of him going back, them getting better, and them actually building something, like I really believe what they're saying about him in terms of him kind of wanting to go, and because like what we see, I don't know why I can't think of his name right now, but the head coach, he just said his name. Campbell. Like, man, I want to run through the TV when I see him, give some of the speeches he gives, so I know that if you work for him and if he's talking to you like, look, man, hey, look, I know, how he talks all raspy, I mean, this is a great opportunity for you, but I just think if we get one more chance, man, we might run the whole thing. All right, then, boss. I come back. Let's see. And
I could run into Dan Campbell at like an Hardee's, and he could order a cheeseburger, and I'd go back there and cook it for him. You know what I'm saying? I would do just about man. I get you a burger. I don't care if I'm behind you in line.
And so that's now I believe it, because I Dan Campbell is believable, and what they're doing makes me believe that Ben Johnson had unfinished business, and so I'm happy for him, and he is squarely number one on my list right now. So I mean, I hope we get the opportunity, to call him back, and I hope that he's more ready, for it, especially now that it won't be a surprise to him. Everybody's talking about it, so he's thinking about it today.
Can we just make sure we don't hire Bill O'Brien, please? Can we make sure we don't do that?
I know. No one's mentioned Bill Belichick. I'm shocked.
Yeah, I'm out. I'm out on both of those guys, but all four of us consensus Ben Johnson #1. So
Yeah.
I think it's pretty well known in the media from last season going in now to this year, unfortunately, that Ben Johnson is the #1 choice. I think it just comes down to if he wants the job or not. So
he's just going to be the #1 choice for every vacancy, man.
That's the issue. Yeah.
Let me
Chargers and Herbert. That's gonna
what
be
happens if the
one.
Bills get rid of Sean McDermott and he's got a chance to go up there too? I mean, I
hope they're not that stupid.
I hope they're not that stupid too.
Yeah, it's just the one person that scared me from Dave Tepper, though, not from desire of mine, but I think we have to remember how Kellen Moore was so high on his list last year too.
Yeah, that's another one.
I don't want to do that.
I know, but it's scary. And I mean, the one thing I want you all to do, if y'all haven't done it thus far, like, man, please squash all these talks of Greg Olsen's or whoever is.
Hey, I had to ride a little bit. That tweet I had, I knew that shit would take off. I had to ride that wave a little bit.
No, it's.
But
Greg
yeah,
Olsen,
I know.
Greg
I
Olsen,
agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, it feels good. It may even be good.
But hey,
right?
John Lynch,
but
man.
He's not the coach.
Put him in the front office then. Yeah, put him in a player personnel. Give him an assistant player personnel.
Yeah, let him be tight ends coach. Sometimes I think the problem with Carolina, and I know I have I don't know, I hate being this way, but I'm old and I had a team before Carolina. But I've seen good stuff, I've seen bad stuff outside of Carolina before. I think sometimes we get so caught up in Carolina, and I don't think people realize how unserious we are perceived by the outside, right? And so sometimes I think a person like Greg Olsen, or even if it was Thomas Davis, it doesn't matter who the person would have been. I think the fact that they think they could just say, I want to do it, and it becomes something, I think that's only possible because it's Carolina. I think they only tried because it's Carolina. Like, I want the Nets situation, because we've been through, 3 coaches in the last 5 or 6 years. I just want the Nets head coach and the Nets hire to be more than just respected. I want everybody to see it and be like, oh, like, Carolina may just be really serious now. Not just from the good feeling stuff with Frank Reich. I'm talking about, if they put that guy and that GM together, they should be official. They should be a legit concern. And it actually feel like it has something substantive behind it. And I haven't felt like that. I've always had this little queasy feeling in the back of my mind, thinking like, but I don't know if it really, really works, because we still got this guy. We still got, I want us to do something really serious and that puts the league on alert. And I think we have an opportunity. And I think Ben Johnson and the right GM could be that.
Could do it. Yeah, I agree with that.
Well, let's leave it at that. Just want to.
Sure you don't want to keep going on anything else? We haven't really been on for that long. If you want to keep going.
Hey, I'll say this, man, Ricky, man, I enjoyed, chopping it up with you. I've heard you. You sound like you should be on television.
Man, I appreciate that. Somebody said today that they thought that I was asking questions in the presser because it was Kyle Bailey.
Oh yeah. You definitely have the radio voice, but it's been a pleasure, man, and
man,
to see you here.
I very much enjoyed getting to talk to you, man. And I even told Curtis and Bryson before you came on, man, I was like, man, I've interacted with JJ a handful of times on Twitter, and I enjoy like 98% of the stuff that he says. I was like, I think he's really smart, man, and has a great perspective on the game of football. So like, it has been, honestly, man, I've really enjoyed getting to sit here and share
and just know this. Just know this: the 2% is very, very intentional. It's very intentional.
Man, I hear
it's not personal. It's very intentional. It's calculated.
Well, let's leave it at that. Just thank both of you guys again for coming on. 2.5 hours. I know many people wouldn't do that, so I appreciate it. I know it's late. We all know JJ, Panthers culture. Check his stuff out. He's also got Scouting the Culture with Vincent. We've had him on from across the pond. He's always good to talk to, very level-headed. And then Ricky, we appreciate you. You do a lot of good stuff with Cat Cray Blog and then also your Kitty Lit podcast. Go give them a follow, subscribe to them, listen to them as well, wherever you get your podcast. So just appreciate both of you guys.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you.
Absolutely.
All right, Bryson, let's get to the game prediction for this week. Don't really want to do this because I don't think they got a shot, just the way this team is going. But, hey, they might have Baker Mayfield. Actually, they're going to Tampa, so they'll be going down there. What do you got for a prediction? Give me a score.
Yeah, Carolina going down to Tampa, Baker Mayfield revenge game. Carolina is a 5-point underdog. Currently, historically since 2018, interim head coaches in their first game as a head coach, 8-5. So pretty good record. Pretty good record. Team gets motivated, playing for their ex-head coach, whatever. Tampa has lost, I think, 4 or 5 games in a row.
2.
They've been bad. 2 in a row?
2. I just looked it up. They beat
my apologies.
They beat Tennessee 3 weeks ago. They've lost the last 2, 49ers and Colts.
Okay. Yeah, my apologies. That is very true. But they have lost the last they've lost 1, 2.
Last 4 or 5, I believe.
Yeah, last 4 or 5. So they're not a very good team. The NFC South isn't very good overall. I think we all know that. But again, this is going to be a uphill climb for the Panthers. I do think they can win this game. I don't know if they will. I'm going to predict that they won't, but I think that there is a possibility that they do rally around Chris Tabor and play for Frank Reich's memory in Carolina. But I'm going to go Bucks 24, Panthers 17.
Yeah, you took my score, and I'm going to stick with it too. I've been saying 17 for Carolina for weeks, and this seems they can't even get past that. So Let's do 24-17. Bucks too much. They got pieces on offense. I don't think Carolina can mess with. And then offensively, they've just struggled. And I just want to see progress from Bryce Young. Don't care about really anything else. Stay healthy.
Yeah.
Let's see some progress and growth from him. Obviously, this season is a punt at this point, but it's kind of where I'm at. So we'll leave it at that. We just want to thank everyone for tuning in to the Panthers on Tap podcast. You can catch our episodes wherever you get your podcast. Go give us a follow on Twitter at Panthers on Tap for all your analysis and breaking news. And as always,